For 5 years, I wired $30,000 a year to a private trauma clinic in Vermont because my son-in-law told me my daughter was too unstable to come home. Then my 8-year-old granddaughter tugged my coat at the harvest fair, looked up at me like she was passing state secrets, and whispered, "Grandpa, Mom isn't in Vermont. She's in the glass room behind the garage, and when the silver wind chime rings, she has to face the wall and stop talking." I did not drop the coffee in my hand. I did not grab Lily by the shoulders and ask her to say it again. I did not turn and scan the crowd for Evan the way every instinct in my body demanded. At 67, you learn there are moments when panic is a luxury. Panic is what people indulge when they still have time. I knew, the second those words left my granddaughter's mouth, that time had been the one thing I no longer had. So I crouched down until my face was level with hers and I said, as gently as I could, "What glass room, sweetheart?" Lily looked over her shoulder before she answered. Not in the casual way children look around when they lose their train of thought. She looked the way adults in bad marriages look around, quickly, carefully, checking sightlines. That nearly stopped my heart more than the words had. "The room behind the garage," she whispered. "Dad says it's not a room, it's a step-down recovery suite, but Mom sleeps there. Sometimes she cries at night. I can hear her when my window is open." I kept my voice even. "And the wind chime?" "The silver one, the one with the little moon on it. When it rings, Dr. Voss says Mommy has to do regulation." She turns around and looks at the wall and puts her hands flat and stops talking until they tell her she can stop. A child should not know the phrase, step-down recovery suite. An 8-year-old should not speak the language of compliance. "Does your mom know you told me this?" Her eyes widened instantly. "No. Grandpa, don't tell. If Dad knows, he'll say I confused treatment with memories again." That phrase too, confused treatment with memories. I smiled in a way I did not feel. "I won't say a word, I promise." Then Evan Mercer appeared through the moving crowd carrying 2 caramel apples and wearing the smile that had fooled nearly everyone for years. Nearly everyone. He was 41, handsome in the careful way some men remain handsome because they study what handsomeness does for them. His coat fit too well. His hair always looked deliberately careless. His voice could shift from tenderness to authority without warning, and people who only met him once always called him polished. That had been the word attached to him from the beginning. Polished. Self-possessed. Impressive. Good with investors. Good with doctors, good under pressure. What people meant was that he never looked rattled. People like that make others feel primitive when they raise concerns. They know exactly how much composure can buy. "There you two are," he said cheerfully. "Lily, I thought we were getting on the hayride." Lily's shoulders lifted so slightly that most people would never have noticed, but I did. It was not joy, it was a brace. "She was telling me about the blue ribbon goat," I said. Evan laughed. "That tracks. She's obsessed with the animals today." Then he looked at Lily and rested a hand on the back of her neck, a small gesture, soft enough to be mistaken for affection, firm enough to guide. "Ready, Bug?" She nodded without looking at him. And just like that, the crowd moved around us. The Ferris wheel turned, a teenage boy shouted something from the game tents, and the world performed its old vulgar trick of continuing to exist while yours changed shape inside your chest. I watched Evan lead my granddaughter away, and I understood 2 things at once. The first was that my daughter Claire had not been in Vermont in any meaningful sense for a very long time. The second was that if I moved too quickly, I might lose both of them. I had loved my daughter in the simple, unremarkable way fathers often love the child who made them softer without ever announcing the fact. Claire was 34 by then, a woman with her own child, her own house, her own name on mortgage documents and school forms and tax returns. But in my mind, she still existed in layers. At 6 in yellow rain boots, stomping through puddles while my wife Ruth shouted from the porch that she would catch pneumonia if she kept it up. At 15 in a choir dress, singing with one hand clenched at her side because she had inherited my stage fright and her mother's stubbornness. At 27, standing in the doorway of my kitchen with a look on her face that made me understand before she even said the words. "Dad, I met someone." That someone was Evan. If I am honest, I disliked him before I had anything solid to justify the feeling. He arrived with flowers for Ruth's grave on the 1st anniversary after Claire introduced us. He brought a bottle of wine I could not afford myself. He looked me in the eyes and asked good questions about the plumbing supply business I had spent 38 years building from a single rented warehouse outside Hartford. He laughed when laughter was expected. He complimented Claire without overdoing it. He praised the house without sounding greedy. And yet from the first meal he ate at my table, I felt watched by him, not seen. There is a difference. Being seen has warmth in it. Being watched feels like inventory. My wife Ruth used to say that some people enter a room with curiosity and others enter with appetite. Watch which kind he is. She would tell Claire when our daughter was young and dating boys with loud trucks and bad haircuts. Curiosity asks who you are. Appetite asks what your life can do for theirs. When Claire first brought Evan over, Ruth had already been gone 7 years, but I could hear her voice anyway. I remember exactly what Evan asked me once dessert was on the table. "You built this place yourself?" I nodded. "Most of it. The addition, too." "That's rare," he said. "Men used to leave things behind. Now everybody just leases and flips." He said it admiringly, and Claire glowed at the fact that he was taking interest in my work. But the comment did not feel admiring to me. It felt like a note being made. This man leaves things behind. This man values permanence. This man might have assets protected from chaos. Those may sound like paranoid interpretations. At the time, I told myself I was reading too much into a sentence. That is how manipulation thrives. It does not begin with actions dramatic enough to justify alarm. It begins with dozens of tiny moments that each seem too minor to challenge. By the end of that first dinner, Evan knew how long I had owned the house, whether I still drew a salary from the business, how many stores I had sold in 2014, and whether Claire was the sole beneficiary on Ruth's life insurance policy. He learned all of that without asking a single crude question. He asked about memory, about legacy, about what I wanted the business to become after me, about how Ruth and I had planned for Claire. He moved like a man checking the weather, casual on the surface, systematic underneath. That night, after Claire left with him, I stood in the kitchen rinsing dishes and felt something old and tired inside me wake up. Fear, perhaps. Not fear for myself. Men my age spend less and less time fearing for themselves. What we fear is watching our children walk into a storm we recognize too late. The next morning, I opened the file cabinet in my study and reread the trust paperwork Ruth and I had signed 2 years before she died. I should explain that part, because it matters more than I understood at the time. Ruth was the practical one in our marriage. I built and fixed and improvised. She anticipated. She had been a high school guidance counselor, the sort who remembered students' siblings' names and mailed sympathy cards without putting it on a calendar. She loved people, but she did not romanticize them. When she got sick, she did not spend her clear-headed days pretending that good intentions would protect Claire after she was gone. She sat at the dining room table with legal pads and banker boxes and built a fortress out of paper. There was a trust. There were insurance policies. There was the lake parcel her father had left Claire in Vermont, 40 wooded acres and an old seasonal cottage on Black Pine Lake that looked modest until developers started circling that area. There were instructions about how distributions would work. There were clauses designed to keep a future spouse from gaining control through pressure or charm. There was a separate letter Ruth wrote by hand, not legally binding, tucked into the folder with the copies. "Protect her with structure, not sentiment," the letter said. "If she marries well, the structure will never offend anyone. If she marries badly, it will save her life." At the time, I had found the sentence bleak. Years later, I realized it was not bleak, it was merciful. I never told Claire how much of her mother lived inside those folders. I did not want her to feel managed from beyond the grave. I simply kept everything where I could reach it. The original trust papers in our safe deposit box, copies in my study, and one set of sealed documents in a downtown storage locker that I rented under the business name and almost never mentioned. I told myself I was being prudent. The truth is that Ruth had taught me that prudence is just love wearing work clothes. Claire and Evan dated for 1.5 years before they married. During that time I watched, and because I watched, I saw things Claire did not. I saw how Evan redirected conversation whenever it touched her old friends. Someone would ask whether she still met up with Danielle from college or the women she taught with at the elementary school, and Evan would answer before Claire could. "They're all in such different phases," he would say, smiling. "We've really become each other's home base." It sounded romantic unless you knew what healthy love sounds like. Healthy love expands a person's world. It does not replace it. I saw how quickly he began handling practical details that had never needed his hands. Claire was capable to a fault. She paid bills on time, kept lists, color-coded lesson plans, remembered every birthday. Yet somehow, within 8 months of dating Evan, he had taken over to make her life easier. First taxes, then refinancing advice, then insurance, then her retirement account because fees were killing her. She called it a relief. He called it teamwork. I called it annexation, though only in my own head. When I raised even mild concerns, Claire's face changed in a way that frightened me because it was not anger so much as embarrassment. Evan had already arranged the emotional terrain so that skepticism toward him felt to her like criticism of her judgment. "Dad, I know you're protective," she said once while drying dishes at my sink after Sunday lunch. "But you don't have to test him. He really loves me." That is another thing abusers understand early. If they can make their partner believe that doubt itself is a form of disloyalty, half their work is done. I kissed Claire on the temple and said I knew that. It was easier in the moment than pushing. Easier, and I thought, wiser. I have replayed those years so often that certain scenes now have the hard brightness of old nightmares. The way Evan insisted on combining bank notifications into a shared email because too many separate logins are a security risk. The way he corrected Claire's memory in front of other people with a laugh. No, babe, that was Saturday, not Friday. You've been so scattered lately. The way Claire began apologizing for ordinary human things, forgetting a scarf, showing up 10 minutes late, feeling overwhelmed, laughing too loudly, crying too quickly. The wedding itself was beautiful enough to be printed in magazines. Summer linen, white hydrangeas, candlelight against old stone walls. Claire in a simple silk dress that made her look older and younger at once. Evan composed and gracious, kissing her hand during the vows as if he had been trained by old movies. There is a photograph from that day that sat on my piano for 3 years before I finally turned it face down. In it, Claire is looking at Evan with complete trust. Evan is looking slightly past the camera. Even now I cannot decide what disturbs me more, that no one else saw it, or that I saw it and still let the day happen. After the wedding, they moved into the house on Briar Lane, the one Claire bought with part of Ruth's insurance and part of her own savings before she ever met Evan. Detached garage, half-acre, maple tree in front, a place with good bones. Evan called it their forever home in every toast, every holiday card, every conversation about the future. By the end of the first year, he had refinanced it into a structure I did not like and could not fully untangle because Claire kept saying it was fine and that Evan understood these things better than she did. Then Claire got pregnant. You would think pregnancy might soften a man like Evan, or at least distract him from conquest. Instead, it gave him a higher moral vocabulary to hide behind. Every controlling impulse became concern. Every criticism became care. Every restriction became protection of the baby. Claire was 30 when Lily was born after a brutal labor that lasted 22 hours and ended in an emergency surgical delivery. She lost blood, she lost sleep, she lost confidence in her body in the way many women do after traumatic births and then punish themselves for naming. When I saw her in the hospital, she held Lily like someone holding both miracle and evidence. There was love in her face and fear. "Dad," she whispered once Evan stepped out to get coffee, "what if I'm bad at this?" I laughed softly because that question could only come from someone taking it seriously. "Then you'll already be better than most." But Claire's fear did not fade once they went home. It sharpened. Lily had reflux and slept in bursts. Claire had stitches that healed slowly. Her milk supply was painful and inconsistent. Evan went back to work quickly and presented himself to everyone else as the supportive husband stretched thin by an unpredictable infant and a wife who was having a rough adjustment. The phrase traveled fast because it sounded compassionate. A rough adjustment. By the time Lily was 3 months old, Claire had dark circles under her eyes and a tremor in her hands from exhaustion. When I offered to stay nights, Evan said they had it handled. When I suggested a postpartum specialist, he told me they were already consulting someone excellent. When Claire forgot a casserole in the oven and burned the dish, he retold the story at Thanksgiving like it was charming and lightly concerning at once. "She's got motherhood brain bad," he said with a laugh, touching her shoulder. Claire smiled because people were watching. I remember the first time she cried in my driveway after Sunday dinner while Evan buckled Lily into the car seat. "I'm so tired," she said. "I think he might be right that something's wrong with me." I wanted to say no. I wanted to say that exhaustion, pain, hormonal upheaval, isolation, and criticism could make anyone feel unsteady. I wanted to say that motherhood under observation is not the same as madness. Instead, I said, "Then let's get you the right help." That sentence became the hinge on which the next 5 years turned. Help arrived in the form of Dr. Miriam Voss. She was in her early 50s, beautifully composed, silver hair cropped close to her jaw, the kind of clinician whose calm can feel like wisdom until you realize it is simply distance refined into an art. She ran something called the Northridge Institute, a boutique trauma and mood stabilization program with an office in Burlington and an affiliated residential property outside Stowe, or so we were told. Evan found her through a family office contact. That was his phrase. When I met her, she asked precise questions and listened with grave concentration while Claire described panic, insomnia, intrusive fears about dropping the baby, moments of feeling detached from her own hands. Dr. Voss nodded without rushing, which made Claire trust her at once. Then she asked Evan what he had observed. That was where the ground shifted beneath us. He spoke of episodes. He spoke of dissociation. He described finding Claire standing over Lily's crib in the dark, not responding when he said her name. He described a day when Claire apparently put the baby formula in the pantry and the cereal in the refrigerator, then insisted she had not. He described mood lability, memory problems, sudden anger, weeping, confusion. Some of it was true, some of it was interpretation. Some of it, I would later learn, was pure invention. But when a husband speaks in a low, shaken voice about wanting to protect his wife and child, most rooms will tilt toward him. Dr. Voss recommended intensive treatment. Not because Claire was dangerous, she said carefully, but because untreated postpartum trauma could become ingrained. She recommended short-term residential stabilization in Vermont, away from daily triggers, followed by a gradual reintegration plan. Claire cried when she agreed. I cried in the parking lot after. Evan stood beside me with his hand on my shoulder and said, "We'll get her back." It shames me now how much comfort I took from that sentence. The first year of treatment cost $30,000 after insurance. Boutique programs are criminal, Evan said bitterly, showing me a binder of invoices and clinical summaries. But if it gets Claire well, I'll sell my own blood. His own finances, however, were always somehow temporarily inaccessible, allocated, tied up, moving, waiting for maturity, better used preserving household cash flow. I paid without a fight because I had the money, and because the thought of being the reason Claire did not receive care felt monstrous. That is how exploitation works in families. It does not usually begin by asking for something outrageous. It begins by standing next to your love and calling itself practical. At first, I spoke to Claire twice a week by phone. The calls were short. She sounded sleepy, but tender. She said Vermont was quiet. She said the staff were kind. She said she was learning regulation. She said Lily's little voice on speaker made her chest ache, but also gave her something to work toward. She said Dr. Voss wanted to limit emotional overstimulation until her nervous system rebalanced. That language should have unsettled me more than it did. Nervous system rebalanced. Emotional overstimulation. Family access protocols. These phrases sound clinical and therefore clean. That is part of their power. They take pain and translate it into terminology so dense that ordinary love begins to doubt itself. When I asked if I could visit, Evan said Dr. Voss advised against it in the first phase. When I asked if I could drive up and at least see the facility, he said Claire was ashamed and did not want me seeing her like that. When I asked why every call seemed to happen at a slightly different time but always with a staff member nearby, he said that was standard for mood stabilization programs. I believed too much because the alternative was harder. The alternative was admitting I had helped place my daughter into a system controlled almost entirely by the man I mistrusted. By the second year, the calls became less frequent. Claire sounded flatter. Sometimes she said she was transitioning through a step-down phase. Sometimes she said she was not ready for unrestricted contact because guilt and attachment spikes set back her progress. Evan repeated whatever language would best justify the newest barrier. Family therapy was recommended, then postponed. In-person visits were clinically premature. Lily could send drawings but should not see Claire until the treatment team felt maternal exposure would be safe. Maternal exposure. Imagine what kind of room you must be standing in before someone can say maternal exposure and be taken seriously. I sent money. I sent cards. I sent photographs of Lily every time I saw her, though the visits with my granddaughter grew strangely scheduled in public. Park dates, museum afternoons, apple picking with Evan present, never sleepovers, never spontaneous afternoons at my house the way I had once imagined grandfatherhood would look. If I asked for more time, Evan said Lily had become sensitive to routine disruptions. By the third year, Lily had begun speaking in small, rehearsed phrases. Mom's doing nervous system work. Mom needs less emotional intensity. Mom is learning to make safe choices. Children do not invent language like that. They absorb it, whole, from adults who do not realize the damage of turning a family into a treatment script. There were moments when Claire's old self flickered through, and those moments kept me hopeful far longer than perhaps they should have. A birthday voicemail where she laughed at herself for forgetting how old I was and then corrected herself before Evan could. A Christmas card with 3 words squeezed into the fold in handwriting so cramped I nearly missed them. Miss you in blue. Blue had been our old code word for real. Ruth started it when Claire was little. If one of us asked, "Blue answer?" it meant no performances, no politeness, no saying what was easiest. Tell me the true thing. Miss you in blue. I stared at those 4 words for an hour. When I called to ask what she meant, Evan picked up and said Claire was resting after an exposure session. That was when the first cold certainty entered me. Something was wrong. Not wrong in the vague, regrettable, treatable way we had all been encouraged to believe. Wrong in a structured way. Wrong in a hidden way. Wrong in a way that made language itself part of the trap. I started a journal then. Nothing dramatic at first. Dates, times, missed calls, invoice totals, the phrasing Evan used, the phrasing Dr. Voss used, Lily's strange sentences. Which holidays Claire was suddenly not clinically ready for. Which questions made Evan blink too slowly before answering. I did it because I had spent decades in business, and business taught me a truth marriage never had to. Patterns matter more than excuses. By year 4, even Evan had stopped pretending the Vermont program was temporary. The language changed again. Claire was now in an extended therapeutic residence model. Dr. Voss believed premature return to ordinary domestic life could trigger regression. Lily was adapting well to a structured contact plan. Evan was doing his best as a single functional parent while supporting Claire's recovery. People praised him to my face. Evan is remarkable. That poor man. Not everyone would stay so loyal. Loyalty is a word abusers often earn publicly by orchestrating the private conditions they then endure. I watched him collect admiration like interest. I also watched my granddaughter learn to lower her voice before she said anything real. The 5th year began with a new request, not just $30,000 for treatment, another $12,000 for architectural modifications to the step-down residence attached to the family property, because Dr. Voss believed Claire would eventually benefit from gradual maternal proximity without destabilizing access. I remember standing in my study with the estimate in one hand and Ruth's old fountain pen in the other, reading the phrase again and again. Gradual maternal proximity, attached to the family property. I called Evan at once. Attached where? He answered too quickly. On our place. We converted the old studio structure behind the garage. Nothing major. Mostly safety glass, sensory control, climate support. You built something on Briar Lane? It's more of a therapeutic annex. Why didn't anyone tell me Claire was back in Connecticut? There was a pause on the line, long enough to hear him recalibrate. She isn't back, he said. It's part of the step-down sequence. Dr. Voss wanted to avoid overwhelming you with half-stages and false hope. False hope. That was the day I nearly drove straight to Briar Lane and started kicking doors in. What stopped me was not caution. It was Ruth, or rather the memory of her voice in every hard season we survived together. Facts first, fury second. So I waited. And because I waited, I was standing at that harvest fair months later when Lily tugged my coat and told me the truth, in words so small they almost vanished into the wind. Mom isn't in Vermont. She's in the glass room behind the garage, and when the silver wind chime rings, she has to face the wall and stop talking. I went home from the fair without eating dinner. I sat in Ruth's old armchair in the den where the lamps threw yellow light on the bookshelves and tried to breathe in a straight line. On the side table beside me sat the silver wind chime Ruth used to hang on our back porch every spring. It had a small crescent moon at the top. I had not seen it in years. I stood up so fast the chair scraped hardwood. The wind chime on my table was not there. Only the brass hook remained in the keepsake box where I had stored it after Ruth died. And in that instant, with the room tilting around me, I understood one last thing. Evan had not bought a silver wind chime for Claire's regulation. He had taken Ruth's. That meant he had gone through my house at some point, found something my daughter associated with home and safety, and turned it into an instrument of obedience. I put both hands on the table until the shaking passed. Then I picked up the phone and called the only 2 people I trusted with the next part. Naomi Bell, who had been Ruth's attorney and became ours after her death, and Arthur Sloan, a retired state investigator who used to audit medical fraud cases and who still owed me a favor from the winter I helped him keep his roofing business afloat after his heart attack. When Naomi answered, I said, I need you to assume my daughter is being unlawfully confined on her own property under the disguise of psychiatric care. There was no silence, no polite disbelief, only the sound of a woman who had practiced law too long to be shocked by the vocabulary of evil. All right, she said. Start at the beginning, and Daniel, this time don't leave out anything because it sounds too strange. So I started at the beginning, and before midnight, my old life was over. Naomi came to my house the next morning with 2 legal pads, a banker box, and the expression she used only when she expected to find rot under polished flooring. Arthur arrived 20 minutes later in a faded field jacket with a thermos of bad coffee and the mild, resigned face of a man who had spent too many years learning how ordinary evil likes to dress. We spread everything across my dining room table. Invoices from North Ridge, wire confirmations, the Christmas card with Claire's note, my journal, copies of Ruth's trust, the estimate for the glass annex, a school fundraiser brochure with Lily's drawing on the back, something I had not planned to show them until I unfolded it and saw again what she had drawn weeks earlier without any of us understanding. A square building with a door, a woman inside, lines falling from a crescent moon. Naomi looked at the drawing for a long time and then set it down very carefully. Children don't usually fictionalize architectural details, she said. Arthur had already started making columns on a yellow pad. Verified facts, claims, leverage points, risks. He underlined risks twice. Can we call the police? I asked. Arthur shook his head before Naomi even spoke. We can call. That doesn't mean they'll act the way you want. Why not? Because on paper, he said, tapping the invoices, your daughter has a treating psychiatrist, a documented postpartum and trauma history, and an apparent step-down arrangement on family property with financial support from willing relatives. If officers show up and Claire appears sedated or confused, Dr. Voss calls it a therapeutic environment. Evan calls you an agitated family member interfering with treatment, and suddenly we've tipped our hand for nothing. Naomi nodded. And if there are any guardianship papers, even temporary ones, we need to see them before we let Evan know we're looking. I never signed any. That doesn't mean none exist. Arthur leaned back in his chair. We need 3 things. Proof of fraud, proof of coercion, proof Claire isn't where they say she is because she freely chose to be. I felt my jaw tighten. Lily told me. I believe Lily, he said. A judge needs more than a child's whisper at a fair. Naomi opened Ruth's trust folder and began rereading clauses she herself had helped draft more than a decade earlier. I watched her eyes sharpen halfway through page 12. Well, she said quietly, Ruth was more farsighted than even I remembered. She slid the document toward me and pointed to a section I had not read closely in years. If the beneficiary's incapacity is alleged or adjudicated under circumstances reasonably suggesting coercion, undue influence, or direct financial benefit to a spouse or intimate partner, the trustee may suspend discretionary access by all non-blood-related parties pending independent evaluation. I read it twice. Arthur let out a low whistle. Your wife wrote a trapdoor into the trust. Ruth wrote it, Naomi corrected. I just translated it into legal English. My throat tightened unexpectedly. Even dead 12 years, Ruth was still building exits for Claire. Naomi continued reading. It means if I can present a good faith concern that Evan stands to gain financially from Claire being declared incapacitated, we can freeze his access to any trust-mediated distributions immediately. Not criminally, civilly, temporarily, but it buys time. How much time? If a judge signs an emergency protective order, a week, maybe 2, longer if we land hard with evidence. Arthur pointed at the invoice estimate. And architectural modifications to the step-down annex sound a lot like someone preparing for long-term control. Naomi looked at me. Daniel, from now on you do exactly what we say. No surprise visits, no accusations, no calling Dr. Voss to demand answers. You will feel an overwhelming urge to act like a father instead of a witness. Fight it. I've been fighting it for 5 years. Yes, she said, and now you have to fight smarter. We started with paper because paper cannot charm, cannot cry, cannot explain itself out of a contradiction. Arthur ran business registry searches and tax IDs from his laptop, while Naomi contacted a judge she knew in family court to pull sealed filings that mentioned Claire, Evan, or North Ridge. I called my bank and requested 5 years of outgoing wires grouped by recipient entity. By lunch, we had our first hard crack. Northridge Institute was real, only in the technical sense that a thing with a registered LLC and a mailing suite exists. The Burlington office was a 3-room shared professional address. The supposed residential property outside Stowe belonged not to Northridge, but to another company called MV Clinical Holdings, managed by a trust whose mailing agent matched the same Hartford accountant who had incorporated one of Evan's short-lived investment vehicles 4 years earlier. Arthur swiveled his laptop toward us. This is already dirty. Naomi muttered something under her breath that Ruth would not have approved of. It got worse. There had indeed been court filings. Not a completed guardianship, not yet, but 2 emergency petitions over the previous 4 years alleging episodic incapacity, maternal instability, and the need for a structured recovery model to protect minor child welfare. Both had stalled before full hearing because one judge wanted independent review, and because, as Naomi reminded us, the trust structure prevented easy transfer of authority. But the petitions existed, and attached to both were declarations from Dr. Voss, statements from Evan, and one affidavit apparently signed by Claire herself during her stabilization period. I read the copy Naomi obtained and felt sick. I, Claire Harrow Mercer, acknowledge that due to dissociative symptoms and impaired maternal judgment, I am currently unable to safely resume unrestricted parenting or independent financial decision-making. The signature looked like Claire's, but underneath it were sentences that did not. Claire taught 2nd grade before Lily was born. She loved clean language, precise language. She never said resume when she meant return. She never said unrestricted parenting. She never described herself like a clinical memo. Arthur noticed my face. Forgery? No, I said slowly. Worse, coaching. There was another document too, a treatment consent addendum authorizing therapeutic environmental redirection, sensory cues, and regulated communication during periods of destabilization. Sensory cues. Wind chime, Naomi said. I wanted to put my fist through the wall. Instead, I turned the page. Attached to the addendum was an inventory list for the step-down annex. Tempered safety glass, exterior keypad lock, interior camera, acoustic paneling, remote-controlled blind system, wall-mounted sound cue device, single bed, grounding table, medication cabinet, observation chair, observation chair. The language of care is capable of astonishing violence when handed to the wrong people. Arthur stared at the list. This is a holding cell with nicer nouns. We spent the rest of the afternoon building chronology. Year 1 after Lily's birth. Claire exhausted, fearful, seeking help. Year 2, residential treatment in Vermont. Financial dependency deepens, contact narrows. Year 3, emergency petition. Claire's affidavit, child access controlled. Year 4, step-down annex attached to Briar Lane. Architectural modifications, ongoing financial requests. Year 5, annex operational. Lily aware of mother's local confinement. Silver wind chime control cue. The shape of it emerged slowly enough to break me in increments. Evan and Dr. Voss had not simply exploited Claire's vulnerability. They had turned it into a system. When Ruth was alive, she used to tell the girls in her school office that real danger rarely arrives announcing itself. Predators like process, she would say. If they can wrap harm in routine, people mistake the routine for safety. I had quoted that advice to other people over the years. I had not recognized how fully it applied inside my own family. By evening, we had a plan. If plan is the right word for the desperate architecture people build when the truth arrives too late for elegance. Step 1 was verification. Arthur would drive to the Burlington office and see what Northridge actually looked like. Naomi would move for emergency trust protection based on financial self-interest and concealment of Claire's real location. I would do nothing visible except continue behaving as the cooperative father-in-law who had finally stopped asking inconvenient questions. I hated that last part most because it required me to speak to Evan without letting my voice betray what I knew. He called me the following evening before I had to call him. "Hey, Daniel," he said warmly. "Just wanted to thank you again for taking Lily yesterday. She had a great time." I pictured his hand on the back of her neck. "Of course. How are you holding up? These anniversary weeks are always hard on Claire's system." There it was again. Claire's system. As if my daughter were an appliance that overheated predictably. "I've been thinking," I said, forcing steadiness. "Maybe I haven't been supportive enough lately. I know I ask questions when I'm worried." A silence. Not suspicious, interested. "You love her," he said. "No one blames you. I want to help more, whatever the next phase is." He exhaled like a man finally being recognized for the burden he had carefully curated. "That means a lot, Daniel. It really does." By the time we hung up, we had arranged dinner for Friday at Briar Lane. His idea. My chance. When Friday came, I wore the blue flannel Claire bought me for Christmas 6 years earlier and drove to the house with a bottle of wine I did not intend to drink. Briar Lane looked almost exactly as it always had from the front. White siding. Front steps Ruth once told Claire would need replacing in 5 years. The maple tree fuller now, roots pressing up one corner of the walkway. Nothing visible announced that a woman was being kept in a glass structure behind the garage under psychiatric language and keypad control. That is another lesson life teaches late. The most terrible things often happen on streets where hydrangeas still get watered. Evan greeted me at the door with practiced relief. "Daniel, this is good. Really good." He hugged me and I made myself hug him back. The house smelled like rosemary chicken and lemon polish. Lily sat at the kitchen table doing math homework in neat blocks. When she looked up and saw me, her face brightened and then immediately schooled itself into something smaller. Evan did not seem to notice. People like him often do not see fear unless fear is pointed directly at them. "Grandpa," she said. "Hey, sweetheart." Dr. Voss was there too. Of course she was. She stood near the island in cream slacks and a charcoal sweater, holding a glass of sparkling water, as if we were old friends meeting for a fundraising committee, rather than a father and the doctor who had translated his daughter into a case file. "Mr. Harrow," she said smoothly, "I'm glad you came. Claire's progress depends on family coherence." I almost laughed at the obscenity of the sentence. Instead, I nodded. Dinner was a master class in curated normality. Lily was praised for her reading level. Evan discussed school pickup logistics. Dr. Voss talked about nervous system literacy as if it were a weather pattern and not a story she had wrapped around my child's captivity. Twice, I deliberately said things that should have unsettled either of them if their accounts were honest. "Maybe once Claire's ready," I said, "she can come stay with me for a weekend. Different environment." Evan's fork paused for half a second. Dr. Voss smiled. "We're not there yet." Later I said, "I'd love to see the annex sometime. Might help me understand what daily life looks like for her." This time Evan answered first. "It's not really set up for visitors. Even me, it can be dysregulating. Everything dysregulated Claire except the man profiting from her dysregulation." After dinner I asked to help Lily with dishes. Evan agreed easily, perhaps because it made him look generous. At the sink with water running, Lily whispered without looking at me, "She can hear you if you stand by the little tree." "What little tree?" "The one behind the garage, near the White Rocks." I did not react. From the dining room, Evan called, "Everything okay in there?" "Yep," I answered. "Just learning your dishwasher system." When I left that night, I deliberately drove away like a man accepting what he had seen. Then I parked 2 streets over, cut my headlights, and waited. At 10:12, the back porch light clicked off. At 10:27, a narrow band of pale light appeared behind the garage. At 10:31, I heard it. A soft silver chiming carried on cold air. Even from 2 properties away, I knew the sound. Ruth's chime had always had one cracked tube that sang a split second flatter than the others. She used to joke it made the whole thing honest. I got out of the truck and moved along the tree line between yards until I reached the back edge of Briar Lane's property. The detached garage sat 30 yards from the house. Behind it, half obscured by ornamental grasses and a cedar fence, stood what from a distance might once have been called a sunroom. Now it was something else. Rectangular, single-story, glass walls covered partly by remote blinds, a door with a keypad, a narrow strip of patio, white landscaping stones, and to the left of the door, hanging from a metal bracket, Ruth's silver wind chime turning in the dark. I stood there with my hands cold and useless at my sides. A shadow moved behind the blinds, then another. The first was a woman. The second was the shape of a chair. I took one step closer and froze when the interior light brightened. Through a gap in the blinds, I saw Claire. Not clearly, not enough, but enough. Her hair had been cut shorter than she ever wore it. Her shoulders looked thinner. She stood in pale clothes, one hand on the wall, face turned away from the window exactly as Lily had described. Then a second shape crossed the room. Dr. Voss. She touched Claire's elbow and guided her back toward the chair. I bit the inside of my cheek so hard I tasted blood. Arthur had warned me that rage would be our enemy unless I could make it wait. So I made it wait. I went home and wrote every detail down before sleep could blunt any edge of it. Blinds half closed, wall-facing posture, observation chair, Dr. Voss physically present, silver chime active, Claire ambulatory, Claire local. At 2 a.m, I added one more line. Evan stole Ruth's symbol of safety and turned it into a command bell. The next 48 hours moved with the unnatural clarity that sometimes comes when grief finally receives a task. Arthur drove to Burlington and confirmed Northridge's office was almost nothing. A receptionist shared by 3 businesses. 1 consultation room, no sign of any residential program, no visible clinical infrastructure, no overnight staff. When he casually asked whether the institute still handled intensive family recovery placements, the receptionist said, "Oh, Dr. Voss mostly does private consulting and referrals now." Referrals, not 5 years of full-time residential care. Naomi filed emergency motions that same day to suspend any spouse-mediated financial access to Claire's protected assets based on concealment, misrepresentation of location, and direct benefit from incapacity claims. She also prepared a petition for independent psychiatric review, which would require notice to Evan and Dr. Voss once filed. We needed more before we served it. Specifically, we needed something from inside. Lily, as much as I loved her, could not be the foundation of a rescue. A child's testimony can start adults moving, but adults who make a child carry the whole truth are cowards. So we built a narrower risk. I called Evan and told him I had thought more about family coherence. "I'd like to bring Claire something," I said. "Nothing intense. Maybe Ruth's blue cardigan. She always found it grounding." The irony of using their own language on them made me feel unclean, but it worked. Evan hesitated. "Let me check with Dr. Voss." He called back 3 hours later. "She thinks a non-activating item from home could be helpful if it's introduced correctly." Of course she did. Anything could be repurposed if she controlled the meaning. I chose the cardigan carefully. In one pocket, I tucked a folded note so small it could pass for lint. Blue answer. "If you still know me, touch your left wrist when you see me next. If you cannot speak freely, I will wait. I know where you are now." Lily is safe, Dad. I nearly tore the note back out a dozen times. If Evan found it, everything accelerated. If Claire found it but was too frightened to respond, I gained nothing. If Dr. Voss found it, they would tighten every bolt around her. Still, I left it there. Sometimes the only moral choice is a dangerous one. I dropped the cardigan at Briar Lane on Monday afternoon. Evan met me outside. "Thanks," he said. "This could help. Tell her it was Ruth's." He gave me a soft, sympathetic look. "Only if Dr. Voss thinks the association is stabilizing." I stared at him long enough that his smile flickered. Then I nodded and walked away. That night, I did not sleep. At 9 the next morning, while I was standing in my office pretending to review supplier invoices, my phone rang. It was Lily. Not from her number, from Evan's house line. "Grandpa," she whispered. I gripped the desk. "Lily?" Mom wore the blue sweater. My mouth went dry. "Did she say anything?" She cried. Dad said grief releases progress, but when she saw me after dinner, she touched her watch place. Her watch place. Claire had always worn her watch on her left wrist. "Did anyone else notice?" "I don't think so." "Listen to me carefully," I said. "You did nothing wrong, and you don't tell anyone you called." "I know," she said in that same too careful voice. Then, smaller. "Grandpa, can you make the bell stop? There are requests from children that turn into vows the second you hear them." "Yes," I said, "I can." After we hung up, I sat down because my knees had stopped listening to me. Claire was in there. Claire understood enough to answer. Claire knew Lily was safe. That was hope, but hope by itself was not rescue. Hope needed proof and timing, and the kind of restraint that feels indistinguishable from cruelty while you are practicing it. Arthur came over that evening with photos he had taken from public records archives. Permits filed for the annex, contractor names, inspection notes. The structure behind the garage had originally been proposed as an art studio conversion. Midway through the permit trail, the description changed to therapeutic transitional living space. One contractor called Arthur back after he left a vague message asking about prior work for an insurance claim. "Yeah, I remember the job," the man said. "Weird one. Husband wanted safety glass, blind controls, and extra soundproofing. Said his wife was a high-profile wellness client who needed privacy. Did the wife speak to you?" "Nah, I only saw her once through the house window. Looked tired." "Was there any interior lock?" A pause. "Yeah. Husband said it was to prevent elopement during episodes." Elopement, not escape, not leaving. elopement. There is no end to the vocabulary people invent once they decide someone else's will is a symptom. I added the word to my journal in capital letters. Arthur sat across from me while I wrote. You know what this is shaping into, he said. Say it. Coercive control wrapped in psychiatry, financial exploitation, probably medical billing fraud, maybe unlawful confinement depending on what we can show about her consent. I put the pen down, and if she signed forms, then we show what condition she signed them in. His gaze softened slightly. Daniel, people sign away pieces of themselves every day when they've been convinced they're the danger. That doesn't make the danger real. Ruth had a phrase for moments like that too. Name the trick, and it loses a little power. By the end of that week, Naomi had another piece. Dr. Voss had been quietly disciplined 7 years earlier in Massachusetts for boundary issues involving a family treatment model. Nothing criminal, nothing license-ending, but enough that she now practiced through layered entities and consulting arrangements instead of major hospital appointments. She is careful, Naomi said, which means we need her to become careless. How? Naomi looked at me over the rim of her glasses. We give Evan what he has wanted for years, or at least we let him believe we will. I already knew what she meant. Ruth's Vermont land, the lake parcel, the old cottage, the thing Evan had circled since the beginning without ever touching directly enough to trigger alarm. If he believed I was finally ready to liquidate assets for Claire's lifetime care, he would push. If he pushed, Dr. Voss would push with him. If they pushed hard enough, they would expose motive. And if God was still paying attention, maybe they would also expose more. That night I went down to the storage locker downtown for the first time in almost a year. The lock stuck in the cold, and for a second I had to brace my shoulder against the metal door the way I had in the old days moving inventory. When it finally rattled open, the smell hit me first. Cardboard, cedar, a little dust, a little iron, my private archive of every practical thing love had ever made me keep. Bank boxes, insurance copies, Ruth's labeled folders, Claire's old watercolor portfolios, the camping lantern from summers at Black Pine Lake, and in the far corner the cedar chest where Ruth kept objects she called anchors. Inside it lay the things she believed could pull a person back toward themselves when life tried to scatter them. A blue cardigan, a tin of lavender mints, Claire's childhood library card, a recipe card for lemon bread in Ruth's handwriting, a cassette tape labeled Road Trip June 1998, and an envelope addressed simply, for Claire, if she ever forgets what home sounds like. I sat on the concrete floor, holding that envelope, and wept for the first time in years. Not because I was weak, not because I had run out of strategies, because grief and recognition had finally become the same thing. Ruth had seen farther than I had, farther than all of us. I did not open the envelope then. I put it carefully in my coat pocket and drove home through a sleet that made the windshield sound like fingers tapping glass. Behind the garage on Briar Lane, my daughter was sleeping in a room designed to erase her confidence. And in my pocket was something her mother left in case forgetting ever became part of the war. I did not yet know how I would get it to Claire, only that I would. The easiest mistake to make in stories like this is believing that once the truth has been named, rescue becomes a straight line. It does not. Truth is not a key. It is a map, and maps only help if you can still move. For the next 2 weeks, everything depended on misdirection. I called Evan on Sunday afternoon while watching sleet melt off the back fence and told him I had spent the weekend reviewing Claire's long-term needs. I don't want money to become the thing that limits her care, I said. He was quiet for a beat too long. Then, carefully, I appreciate that. I've been thinking about the Vermont parcel. The silence this time had texture, not surprise. Hunger kept polite. You don't have to do anything drastic, he said, every syllable wrapped in false modesty. No, I said, but it might be time to simplify. Ruth always wanted the land to help Claire if things ever got bad. That part was true enough to sting. Maybe we should all sit down, Evan said. With Naomi, with Dr. Voss, build an actual care horizon, not just year-to-year scrambling. Care horizon. I wrote the phrase down the second we hung up. Naomi nearly smiled when I told her. He bit fast, Arthur said. Good. Greedy men get sloppy when they think virtue is finally paying them back. But we still needed more from inside the annex. Something stronger than a glimpse through blinds and Claire touching her wrist. That was where Lily, with all the tragic competence children develop in controlled homes, handed us our next opening without knowing it. She called again 3 nights later from the upstairs bathroom while Evan was on a conference call, and the housekeeper was vacuuming. Grandpa, she whispered, Mom gets library time tomorrow. I closed my office door. What's library time? When Dr. Voss says books are grounding, they let Mom sit in the little room in the house, the room with the shelves, not the glass room. My pulse thudded. The den at Briar Lane sat off the hallway and had windows facing the side garden, older latches, no keypad on that room. What time? After lunch. If she has a green morning. A green morning. As if my daughter were a preschool behavior chart. I kept my voice calm. How do you know? Because I heard Dr. Voss tell Dad. and I saw the paper on the fridge. Can you tell me what else was on the paper? A pause while she tried to remember. Blue sweater, low stimulation. Father may deliver comfort objects if approved. Father may deliver comfort objects. I stared at the wall. Naomi said no the moment I proposed going to the house. Arthur surprised me by saying maybe. Maybe? I repeated. He nodded. If we shape it, Daniel doesn't go charging in. Daniel goes exactly where they invited him, with an item that gives Claire a chance to anchor and us a chance to observe. Naomi crossed her arms. And if it blows up? Then we serve the motions immediately and force the fight before they're ready. She hated that answer because it admitted what all of us knew. There was no version of this where risk disappeared. There was only the version where we chose which risk to live with. So I assembled a box, Ruth's lemon bread, baked from the recipe card in her own handwriting, the envelope from the cedar chest, Claire's old library card, a framed photograph of Ruth and Claire at Black Pine Lake when Claire was 9, both of them laughing because I had just fallen off the dock trying to untangle a fishing line from my boot. And beneath the linen napkin, a tiny digital audio recorder Arthur insisted I carry even if we never used the file. You don't have to force anything. But if someone says something stupid, let them say it on record. I arrived at Briar Lane at 1:10 the next afternoon. Rain glazed the driveway. The maple tree stood black and slick against a white sky. Evan opened the door in a sweater and jeans, casual as a man receiving grocery delivery. Daniel, he said warmly. Perfect timing. Claire's regulated enough for a brief passive visit. Passive visit. Good, I said. I brought a few things. Dr. Voss met us in the hallway. Let's keep the emotional tone low. Claire has had a vulnerable morning. My hands were so cold I could barely feel the cardboard box. Understood. The den looked the same as it had years earlier, except for what was missing. Claire's old teaching books were gone. The ceramic bird Ruth bought at a church fair had disappeared from the windowsill. Family rooms in controlled homes often tell on the controller through subtraction. Warmth becomes clutter. History becomes overstimulating material. Anything that reminds a person who they were before the system is quietly removed. Claire sat in the armchair by the far window with a blanket over her knees and an open book turned face down on the side table. For a second, I did not recognize my own child because everything vivid in her had been dialed down. Her face was thinner. Her hair, once thick and chestnut, had been cut bluntly above her shoulders. She wore the blue cardigan, Ruth's cardigan. The sleeves hung loose over wrists that looked too delicate. Then she looked up, and I knew her instantly. The eyes were still Claire's, clouded, over-medicated, frightened, but hers. For a terrible second, I thought I might fall to my knees right there in front of Evan and Dr. Voss and start apologizing for every year I had mistaken compliance for healing. Instead, I walked to the sofa opposite her and sat. Hi, sweetheart. Her lips parted. No sound came out. Dr. Voss remained standing near the doorway. Evan leaned against the built-in shelves with his arms loose and watchful. Claire's gaze dropped to the box in my lap. I brought lemon bread, I said. Your mom's recipe. A tremor passed through her mouth. That could be activating, Dr. Voss said. Claire's fingers tightened on the blanket. No, she said softly, the first word I had heard from her in person in nearly 2 years. It's okay? Her voice sounded like a road after winter. Damaged, but still there. I set the box on the coffee table and took things out slowly, one by one, as if we were handling museum pieces. The bread, the photograph, the library card. When Claire saw the library card, her eyes filled instantly. You kept that? She whispered. Your mother kept everything. That made something shift in the room. Not dramatically, but enough. Dr. Voss stepped closer. Claire, remember your pacing. Nostalgia can destabilize reality orientation. Claire flinched. Reality orientation. I have never hated 4 syllables more. I picked up the photograph. Do you remember this day, Black Pine? You made your mother laugh so hard she snorted lemonade through her nose. Claire blinked fast. You fell in. Yes, I did. You said the doc was traitorous. Evan straightened almost imperceptibly, because that sentence had not come from nowhere. It had come from memory. I smiled before I could stop myself. That's right. Dr. Voss intervened smoothly. Memory retrieval is useful, but we don't want uncontained family narratives. Claire, can you name 3 things you see in this room right now? Claire's face emptied the way faces do when someone has been trained that every authentic moment will be interrupted by assessment. Window, she said. Lamp. Book. Good, Dr. Voss said. I wanted to break the lamp over the woman's head. Instead, I said, I also found something your mom left. I took the sealed envelope from the box and held it where Claire could see Ruth's handwriting. For Claire, if she ever forgets what home sounds like. Claire made a sound I will hear in my sleep for the rest of my life. Not a sob, not even fully a gasp. More like the noise a person makes when an invisible rope tied around their chest is suddenly pulled. Dr. Voss stepped forward. Perhaps that should wait until a more structured session. No, Claire said again, louder this time. Evan's expression changed, still mild, less polished. Maybe Dr. Voss is right, he said. You've already done a lot today. Claire looked at him then, not with love, Not even with fear exactly, with the expression of someone trying to remember which version of reality she is currently expected to perform. I knew that look because I had seen it once before in a supplier who stayed with his embezzling business partner too long. People under coercive systems do not simply lie or tell the truth, they test the room first. "Sweetheart," I said gently, "you don't have to open it now. I only wanted you to know it exists." Claire's left hand moved under the blanket. Then, slowly, she touched her wrist. The same wrist. A small motion, hidden from everyone but me. I nearly stopped breathing. Dr. Voss noticed nothing. Evan noticed everything. That was the dangerous difference between them. She managed the script. He managed deviations. He pushed away from the shelves. "Maybe that's enough for today." Claire's head snapped toward him. "Please." One word, barely spoken, but it landed. He smiled the smile I had come to despise. 5 more minutes, a reward. Permission dressed as kindness. I handed Claire the envelope. She held it like something warm. "You can keep the box too," I said. Her eyes flicked to mine, then down again. "Thank you." I stood before I either ruined everything or started crying in front of them. As I reached for my coat, Claire said very softly, "Dad?" I turned. She looked at the coffee table instead of at me and said, "The bell isn't for weather." Dr. Voss moved instantly. "All right, session over." Evan guided me into the hallway with firm cheerfulness. "Good visit. Really good visit." I let him usher me out. I nodded at the right times. I got in my truck and drove to the church parking lot half a mile away before pulling over and shaking so hard the steering wheel blurred. The bell isn't for weather. It was the most Claire thing she could have said under supervision. Specific. Dry. A little wry even in terror. By the time I got home, Arthur was already waiting with Naomi. I played the recorder on the dining room table. Most of it was quiet. Paper sounds, a chair creaking, my own breathing too loud in my ears. Then Dr. Voss, then Claire, then the line. "The bell isn't for weather." Arthur leaned back slowly. "She's telling you it's a cue, not a decoration," Naomi said. "And she said it under direct supervision. That matters." I told them about the wrist touch, about Ruth's envelope, about Evan clocking the deviation. Naomi pinched the bridge of her nose. "We need to accelerate." "What happens if Claire opens the letter tonight?" Arthur answered before Naomi could. "Best case, it helps. Worst case, Evan or Voss intercept it." I had already thought of that. What I had not thought of was how fast the next piece would arrive. At 7:40 that evening, Lily called from the back stairwell, whispering so hard I could barely understand her. "Grandpa, Dad took the letter." The room around me went silent. "Did he read it?" "I don't know. Mom cried, and he said she was spiraling into symbolic confusion. Dr. Voss said grounding protocol, and then they rang the bell and took her back." My hand tightened around the phone. "Is your mom okay?" She had to stand at the wall. I closed my eyes. "Listen to me, Lily. Are you safe right now?" "Yes." "Good. Go to your room. Take your headphones. Do exactly what you always do if adults are loud. I'm proud of you. None of this is your fault." Children should never hear those words as often as Lily needed them. The next morning, Naomi filed the motions. All of them. Emergency suspension of spouse-mediated access to trust funds. Petition for independent capacity evaluation. Motion to compel disclosure of Claire's actual residence and treatment conditions. Request for appointment of an independent guardian ad litem to assess Claire's wishes outside the presence of Evan Mercer and Dr. Miriam Voss. Once filed, the papers had to be served. Once served, the war would become official. Arthur wanted a process server with a deputy. Naomi wanted quiet notice first, hoping panic might make them over-explain in writing. I wanted to set Briar Lane on fire. In the end, Naomi won. The papers were emailed and hand-delivered the same afternoon. Evan called me within an hour, voice stripped of half its gloss. "What the hell is this?" I sat at my desk with Arthur on speakerphone beside me, muted. "It's me asking for transparency," I said. "You blindsided us." "No," I said. "You hid my daughter from me for 5 years." He exhaled sharply. "Daniel, Claire is fragile. Legal aggression could undo everything. If everything is legitimate, you shouldn't mind oversight. You have no idea how complex severe trauma is. That may be true, but I understand concealment." A pause. Then the voice changed. "This is something abusers and frauds share. When charm fails, they often reveal contempt with startling speed, as if civility had been costing them more than they could spare. You think you know better than her doctor?" he said coldly. "You think because you built some stores and hoarded paper in a locker you can swoop in now and redefine years of clinical work?" I said nothing. He laughed once without humor. "You know what this really is? Guilt. You left Claire alone with postpartum collapse and now you need a villain." Arthur wrote on a notepad and slid it across my desk. "Keep him talking." I said, "If she's truly receiving residential treatment, why is she behind your garage?" Dead silence, not surprise. Calculation, then he recovered. "Step-down care was explained to you. Not like that." "What exactly did you think transitional proximity meant?" That phrase again, as if jargon could erase geography. "You told me Vermont. She has clinical ties in Vermont. Don't twist things." Arthur wrote, "Ask about money." I took a breath. "If it's all about Claire, why push the Vermont land sale now?" He actually scoffed. "Because unlike you, I live in reality. Lifetime care costs money." Lifetime care, there it was. And if she regains capacity? Another silence. Then too fast? That's not what this is about. Which means it was exactly what it was about. Naomi filed a supplement that night, memorializing the call. By morning, Briar Lane had changed shape. The housekeeper's car was gone. The blinds behind the garage remained shut all day. Lily missed school for a family regulation day, and Dr. Voss's SUV stayed overnight. Arthur parked 2 streets over and watched. At 5:16, he called me. "You need to hear this," he said, then held his phone near a directional mic. A faint sound came through, wind, a car idling somewhere, then a woman's voice, muffled, panicked. Not words, just distress, then the chime, then silence. Arthur's voice came back low and hard. "That was from the annex. I sat down because standing was no longer useful." He continued. "Daniel, I think they know she's slipping out of script." "How bad?" "I saw Voss come out carrying a medication case." That was enough for Naomi. She spent the next 3 hours on emergency calls, and by 9 that night she had something extraordinary. Not a rescue order yet, not entry, but a provisional order bearing any change in Claire's medication regimen without independent review once notice had been served. If they dosed her differently after that, they would be in violation. The problem, of course, was that people like Evan and Dr. Voss often treat legal boundaries as inconveniences unless someone is physically standing there to enforce them. We needed Claire to survive the next 48 hours without being buried deeper inside her own body. That was when Ruth intervened again, the way the dead sometimes do if they were practical enough in life. While reorganizing the contents of the box I had brought back from the failed visit, I found the envelope flap slightly bent, not opened, bent. And tucked between the back layer of the paper and the seam was a second scrap of folded onion skin I had not noticed before. Ruth's handwriting, smaller this time. "If fear ever makes memory too heavy, begin with sound. Play June 1998 before words, then the bread, then the lake, then tell her the loons lied at dusk that year." It took me a full minute to understand what I was reading. The cassette, road trip, June 1998. Claire was 8 that summer. We drove to Black Pine Lake through rain and construction, and a wrong turn that added an hour to the trip. At dusk that first evening, Claire swore she heard wolves. Ruth laughed so hard she had to sit on the dock and explain that the eerie calling was loons, and that one day Claire would remember it wrong and call them lying lake birds forever. The loons lied at dusk that year. It was nonsense to anyone else. A perfect key to Claire. The next question was how to get it to her before Evan locked every inch of air around her. The answer arrived in the most ordinary form possible. The school announced grandparents' literacy morning for Friday. Parents invited, grandparents encouraged, classroom rotations, book donation bins, 100 little performances of wholesome community life. Evan would have to take Lily unless he wanted questions. And if Lily came, so could I. More importantly, Claire had once volunteered at every Literacy Week event before Lily was born. The school still displayed a framed photo of her reading to second graders in a paper crown. If I could create a reason that involved Claire's past competence, maybe even Dr. Voss would allow some symbolic participation. Not in person, perhaps, but maybe through an item. A recording, a note. Naomi called it thin, Arthur called it human. I called it the only opening left. So we used it. I emailed Lily's teacher and asked whether family members could donate favorite childhood books for display. She answered yes within minutes, delighted. I selected Claire's old copy of The Velveteen Rabbit because Ruth had read it so often the spine was soft as cloth. Inside the cover I taped, beneath the library pocket, a tiny QR code sticker Arthur printed that linked to a private audio file. Not a song. Not my voice. The digitized cassette from June 1998. Rain on windshield. Ruth laughing. 8-year-old Claire insisting the birds were lying. My own younger voice saying, "Blue answer, kiddo, they're loons." If Claire heard that, I believed some part of her would remember that home had once been a place where language was for truth, not control. Whether she would hear it at all was another matter. Friday morning, I walked into Lily's elementary school carrying the book in one hand and dread in the other. Evan was there near the cafeteria coffee station, charming 2 mothers into believing he was simply a devoted father, navigating a painful family season with impossible grace. He saw me and gave a tight smile. "Didn't expect you. It's grandparents' morning." "Right." He said it like an inconvenience the school had inflicted upon him. Lily ran up in braids and corduroy overalls, hugging me hard enough to remind me that children will still reach for safety even after they've learned to hide it in public. "Guess what?" she whispered near my ear. "Dad brought Mom's old book for the table." I looked toward the classroom display. There it was, The Velveteen Rabbit. My throat tightened. I had left the book at the front desk only 20 minutes earlier, which meant Evan had already picked it up, recognized it, and decided using it publicly made him look thoughtful. That is the strange luck of manipulative people. Their vanity often opens the very doors their caution would prefer kept shut. "Do you know if your mom saw it?" I whispered. Lily nodded almost imperceptibly. "Dad showed Dr. Voss on his phone and said maybe symbolic literacy could motivate her." I nearly smiled, of course. Of course he had photographed the display to prove his own tenderness. If Dr. Voss let Claire look at that photo long enough, she would see the cover. Maybe even the inside page if he took close-ups. It was a thin thread. We were living on thin threads now. By noon, Arthur had confirmation from a tech contact that the QR code had been activated once from a Briar Lane IP address. Only once. For 37 seconds. 37 seconds was not the full recording, but it was enough for the first line. Rain. Ruth laughing. Blue answer, kiddo. That evening Lily did not call. Neither did Evan. Neither did Dr. Voss. The silence itself felt like movement. Just after 10, my phone buzzed with a blocked number. I answered without speaking. For 3 seconds there was only breath. Then Claire's voice, ragged and very low. The loons didn't lie, and the line went dead. I sat there in the dark den with the phone pressed to my ear long after the call had ended, because my body no longer seemed to know the difference between pain and relief. Claire was awake enough to reach me, which meant the people controlling her were about to become more dangerous than ever. The next morning, Naomi arrived at my house before sunrise carrying a portable scanner, 3 bagels none of us touched, and an emergency motion she had revised twice during the night. Arthur came 15 minutes later with dark crescents under his eyes and a printout from the county clerk's office that made the air in my kitchen feel suddenly thinner. There was a new filing from Evan. Notice of intent to seek full temporary conservatorship over Claire Harrow Mercer, pending independent review, citing family-induced regression, escalating confusion, and unsafe attachment activation following recent outside contact. Family-induced regression. I stared at the page until the words blurred. He's moving to lock us out before the court can get in, Naomi said, and he is building the record that your contact destabilizes her. Arthur tapped the second page. Look at the attachments. There were screenshots of my recent messages asking for transparency, copies of trust notices, a statement from Dr. Voss alleging that Claire had suffered emotional flooding after exposure to legacy objects and had to be returned to a high-support environment. High-support environment. The annex. Naomi's voice had gone flat, which is how it got when she was angriest. If we don't get Claire speaking to an independent evaluator immediately, the entire case turns into a structure against your concern. Then we get her to 1, I said. How? Arthur asked. He's tightening. The answer was ugly, because the truth usually is. We would need Claire to come toward us from inside the system before the system could close around her again. And to do that, we first had to understand the system better than the people who built it. Arthur spent that day doing what retired investigators never fully stop doing once they no longer have badges. He called former colleagues. He pulled archived complaint patterns. He traced pharmaceutical deliveries to Briar Lane through a pharmacy benefit manager he knew someone inside. Naomi forced limited disclosure through the court, arguing that if Evan wanted emergency authority, he had to show actual treatment records to justify it. By late afternoon, we had more than I wanted and less than I needed. The medication list alone explained part of Claire's fog: sedative hypnotics, an antipsychotic at a dose higher than I had been led to believe, a beta blocker used for acute panic, intermittent use of a short-acting tranquilizer, all justified in notes full of slippery phrases: transient derealization, behavioral looping, maternal fixation spikes, resistance to redirection. No one outside that ecosystem would know what those notes really described. To an exhausted court clerk, it looked like care. To me, it looked like the medical version of sanding a person down until they no longer had enough edge left to resist. Then Arthur found the billing codes. Northridge had charged for residential trauma stabilization during months when contractors and inspectors documented the annex in use. They had billed parent coaching and environmental cue management at the same time. They had also billed family reunification consults on dates Claire was supposedly too fragile for contact. He put the spreadsheet in front of me and said, "This is greed getting lazy." Naomi stared at one line. "Hold on." She traced her finger across a January billing entry from 2 years earlier, home-based corrective attachment rehearsal. "What is that?" I asked. Arthur rubbed his jaw. "I've seen similar language in fringe programs: role repetition, rehearsed interactions, basically making someone perform approved responses until they can produce them under stress." My stomach turned. They trained her. Naomi did not look up from the page, or punished her for failing to perform. That night, for the first time since Ruth died, I opened the bottle of bourbon we had been saving for Claire's 40th birthday one day in some imaginary safer future. I poured a single finger, sat in the den, and forced myself to revisit every strange thing Claire had said over the years. "I am learning regulation. I am not ready for unrestricted contact. Maternal exposure is too activating. I need less emotional intensity. I don't want to contaminate Lily's secure attachment." At the time I heard those as the borrowed language of treatment. Now I heard something else. A woman being given a script. A woman repeating terms that let other people define her. A woman using their nouns because her own had been turned against her. My mind went back to the year Lily was born, and once I started looking through that period with new eyes, memory stopped feeling like memory and started feeling like evidence that had been sitting unlabeled in plain view. There was the afternoon Claire called me crying because she had found Lily's bottle warming in the microwave and could not remember putting it there. She said Evan had come home furious because microwaving formula created hot spots. She said he had looked genuinely scared and asked whether she'd blacked out. At the time, I had reassured her. Sleep deprivation makes people forget things. New mothers are exhausted. Anyone could make that mistake. Now I remembered something else too. Claire did not own a microwave that year. She hated them, said they made food taste tired. Evan must have put the bottle there, or lied about finding it there. Then there was the bathtub incident. Claire called me 2 months after starting with Dr. Voss and said she could not stop shaking because she had apparently left the bathroom while Lily was still in the baby seat on the tile floor. Evan found them and told her she had been staring into the hallway mirror as if she didn't know where she was. Claire insisted she had only gone to grab a towel. Evan said she had been gone long enough for the baby to scream. I had believed that too. But later, when Lily was 4, she told me with childish annoyance that her father never let towels stay where they belonged. He moved them to make mom learn systems. At the time, I thought it was a quirk. Now I understood the cruelty. Create disorientation, relocate ordinary objects, then narrate the confusion back to the victim as evidence of instability. I took out my old journal and started flipping page by page, no longer reading for patterns of abuse in general, but for specific acts of manufactured unreliability. Claire saying she swore she paid the electric bill, and Evan saying no, he had to rescue the situation. Claire insisting she never agreed to skip her friend Danielle's baby shower, and Evan saying maybe she forgot. Claire becoming frantic because Lily's vaccination card had gone missing, then Evan finding it in a folder Claire must have placed absent-mindedly. Every act small enough to survive challenge, every act cumulative enough to destroy self-trust. By 1 a.m, I had covered 3 legal pads with timelines and questions. At the top of the 4th, I wrote the sentence that finally made the whole thing clear. He did not only trap her after she was vulnerable, he helped manufacture the vulnerability he now managed. When Arthur returned the next morning, I read the line to him. He nodded grimly. That's how some of the worst controllers work. They don't exploit a storm. They seed clouds and then act like the only shelter. Naomi spent the day in court arguing for emergency access to Claire by an independent psychiatric evaluator. The judge, a tired woman with a reputation for caution, refused immediate removal, but granted a narrow order. Within 72 hours, Claire was to be interviewed privately by a court-appointed evaluator. No spouse in the room. No treating clinician dictating conditions. No child present. It was not the rescue I wanted. It was enough to make Evan panic. He called me that evening, sounding transformed back into grief-stricken martyrdom. Daniel, I am begging you to reconsider the adversarial path. You mean the path where a neutral person talks to Claire without you there? It's not neutral when you've poisoned the situation. I almost laughed at the nerve of it. Poisoned it how? With insinuation, with symbolic manipulation, with your obsessive mistrust. I let him talk. This time he gave me more than anger. He gave me philosophy. Some people can't survive direct choice in early recovery, he said. Too much autonomy too soon is just another trauma. Claire needs structure. She needs containment. She needs not to be handed back her old life until she can hold it without shattering. There is a type of tyrant who genuinely believes that by calling domination structure often enough he becomes wise. I said, and who decides when she can hold it? A beat. The professionals, he said, not Claire, not Lily, not law. The professionals, meaning Dr. Voss, meaning himself. Arthur listened to the recording afterward and said, that's not a husband talking, that's a jailer who thinks he's a reformer. The next problem was practical. Even with a court-ordered interview, Evan could still try to sabotage Claire's state before the evaluator arrived. Increase sedatives, stage an incident, trigger what he would call regression. If Claire met the evaluator barely awake, we might lose the very opening we had fought to create. So for the first time, we reached beyond ourselves. Naomi contacted Dr. Lena Ortiz, a psychiatrist with forensic experience and no personal ties to anyone involved. She could not replace the court evaluator, but she could advise on warning signs of medication misuse and what questions might help distinguish actual psychosis from coercive scripting. Arthur briefed a domestic violence advocate named Sheila Mercer, no relation to Evan, who specialized in high-control family systems involving children. Sheila listened to the whole story and said something I wish I had heard years earlier. People always imagine coercion as one person overpowering another with visible threats, but more often, it's a slow theft of confidence. By the time the person is trapped, they think their own confusion proves the trap is deserved. Then she added, if your daughter has been trained to distrust her own mind, don't push memory first, push recognition. Give her one thing she can know without anyone interpreting it for her. What thing? Who gets calmer when she obeys, Sheila said, and who gets angrier when she thinks for herself? It was so simple I hated that I had needed someone else to say it. Meanwhile, Lily, who should have been worrying about spelling tests and soccer snacks, was quietly documenting more than any adult had a right to ask. On Saturday, she drew a picture during our supervised library outing. I say supervised because Evan had suddenly become generous with public visits again once court scrutiny arrived. He believed visibility made him look innocent. The drawing showed 3 windows, 1 house, 1 small square room, 1 silver moon shape hanging outside. And beside the woman in the square room, Lily had drawn a little rectangle with a black dot in the center. "What's that?" I asked. "The eye." "What eye?" She looked up, puzzled that I would not know. "The camera eye. Mom says don't wave at it because then Dad knows you know." I folded the drawing and put it in my coat pocket with hands that wanted to fail me. "Did your mom say anything else?" Lily thought for a moment. "She said books are safer than talking." Books are safer than talking. That sentence became our next plan. Sunday evening, while Evan was busy performing reasonableness in email exchanges with Naomi, Arthur and I drove to an all-night copy shop 2 towns over and assembled a fake packet titled Transitional Reading Materials for Structured Reintroduction. The cover page carried Northridge branding, Arthur recreated from scanned invoices. Inside, we placed photocopied poems, short grounding exercises, and between pages 19 and 20, a thin folded sheet Claire would recognize instantly. It was Ruth's lemon bread recipe card, not the original, a color copy. On the back, in my handwriting, blue answer: who gets calmer when you obey? Who gets angry when you remember? The evaluator comes Tuesday at 2. If you want out, ask for the lake. Ask what happened the night of the missing towels. Ask why your father was told Vermont. Lily is safe. You are not the danger. Dad. Naomi objected to the risk. Arthur argued that we were already inside risk and might as well stop pretending otherwise. In the end, the packet reached Briar Lane by hand courier through the same contractor supply office that had delivered environmental support materials there before. Arthur called in a favor with the receptionist and said it was an update from Northridge Records for Dr. Voss's review. Would it reach Claire? We did not know. Would Evan notice the inconsistency? Possibly. Would Dr. Voss smell a trap? Maybe. But on Monday morning, something happened that convinced me the packet or something like it had landed. Evan emailed Naomi requesting that the evaluator avoid discussing historical incidents not directly relevant to current capacity. Historical incidents. That phrase had not appeared anywhere in the court order, which meant someone on his end was suddenly afraid of the past. Tuesday came cold and brilliantly clear, the kind of winter afternoon New England sometimes throws at you, as if sunlight can compensate for what the wind does to your face. The evaluator, a court-appointed psychologist named Dr. Samuel Reeves, had a reputation for being maddeningly slow and nearly impossible to charm. Naomi liked him for exactly that reason. The interview was set for 2 o'clock at Briar Lane. At 1:41, Arthur called from his surveillance spot and said the annex blinds were still closed. At 1:52, Dr. Voss arrived carrying a folder and a medication tote. At 1:57, Reeves's sedan pulled into the driveway. At 2:10, no one had entered the annex. At 2:14, the front door opened and Evan came out with Dr. Reeves, both men walking toward the garage. My pulse pounded. "Why is he taking him there?" I asked. Arthur answered in a tone I had only heard a few times in our long friendship. Because he wants the evaluator to see Claire in the environment that justifies his control. I closed my eyes for 1 second and pictured Claire standing at the wall because a stolen wind chime told her to. "Can you hear anything?" "Not from this distance." The interview lasted 48 minutes. 48 minutes in which I sat in my study staring at Ruth's handwriting on old trust papers and wondering how many times a woman can be asked whether she is competent while drugged, watched, and conditioned before the asking itself becomes a form of violence. At 2:59, Arthur called again. "Reeves is leaving." And? I couldn't hear the content, but Evan's jaw was tight. Voss looked angry, not confident. That was all we got for 6 hours. Then, just after 9, Naomi phoned. Reeves had filed a preliminary sealed note with the court. He was not ruling on full capacity yet. He wanted records, he wanted medication logs, he wanted unsupervised follow-up, and most importantly, he had written one sentence that shifted the balance. Subject appears highly suggestible within current treatment environment and demonstrates signs of possible coercive dependency inconsistent with unilateral spouse narrative. I sat down on the stairs because standing had become too hopeful a posture. Naomi let me have the moment and then said, "Don't celebrate, this makes them cornered." She was right. The next morning, Briar Lane erupted. The housekeeper quit. A contractor van arrived and left within 20 minutes. Arthur saw Evan loading document boxes into his SUV. And at 11:30, Lily's teacher called me because Lily had not come to school, and the absence report listed family medical emergency. I drove straight to Briar Lane against orders, against reason, against every plan Naomi and Arthur had crafted. I got as far as the mailbox before Arthur's truck cut in front of mine and blocked the driveway. He got out furious. "What are you doing?" "My granddaughter is missing school, and he's moving boxes." Arthur yanked my door open. "Exactly, he wants you impulsive. He wants witnesses to see the unstable father-in-law making a scene." "I am unstable." "I know," he said, "so use it later." He was right again, which I hated him for in that moment. We parked half a mile away and watched instead. At 1:15, Dr. Voss's car left. At 1:27, Lily appeared in the back seat of Evan's SUV. At 1:29, the SUV drove not toward the school, not toward Hartford, but north. Toward Vermont. For a second, the world went silent. "He's moving them," I said. Arthur was already on the phone with Naomi. By 1:40, every legal mechanism we had was in motion. Emergency notice of risk of removal, request for child welfare check, petition to bar interstate transfer pending review, a call to state police, a call to Vermont authorities, a call to Dr. Reeves. But paperwork is slower than tires on winter roads. Arthur looked at me and said, "Get in." We followed Evan north under a sky the color of dirty steel, keeping 3 cars between us when traffic allowed, more when it didn't. If you have never followed someone carrying your whole future in their back seat, let me tell you what happens to time. It ceases to move normally. Minutes become feverish and sticky. Every exit ramp feels like fate deciding whether to spit you out or keep dragging you forward. At 3:26, Evan turned off the interstate and onto a 2-lane road lined with firs and stone walls. 10 minutes later, he pulled through a wrought iron gate onto the Black Pine Lake parcel. My parcel, Claire's parcel, Ruth's land. The old cottage had been renovated beyond recognition. What used to be weathered cedar and screened porches was now a sleek winterized house with black trim, new glass, and a separate auxiliary structure by the tree line that made my stomach turn before I fully saw it. Another annex, not as large as the one behind the garage, but designed by the same mind. Glass, blinds, control. He had been preparing a transfer point, a more isolated version, a cleaner narrative, Vermont on paper at last. Arthur swore quietly and reached for the phone again. This time the state police moved faster because geography had done what language could not. The moment Evan crossed state lines with a minor child while subject to pending review and probable concealed confinement questions, the whole situation became harder for anyone respectable to ignore. But respectable systems still required minutes, and Evan already had land, locks, and distance. We waited in the trees as snow started to come down in dry, thin needles. At 4:14, a second vehicle arrived. Dr. Voss. At 4:22, lights came on in the small annex. At 4:28, the silver wind chime hanging by the cottage door began to move in the wind. He had brought that too. Of course he had. Ruth's chime, Ruth's land, Ruth's daughter, all folded into his private mythology of justified control. I wanted him dead in that moment. There is no cleaner way to put it. I wanted his chest to stop rising. I wanted Dr. Voss's hands to forget every deceitful skill they had used. I wanted the lake to swallow the whole house. Instead, I stood in the dark with snow catching on my coat and waited for law to become real enough to enter the scene. At 5:06, the first cruiser arrived. Then another. Then a Vermont child welfare supervisor. Then, astonishingly, Dr. Reeves himself, summoned by Naomi with whatever combination of urgency and legal terror she had mastered over 30 years. The officers approached the cottage first. Voices rose. A child cried. A woman shouted from farther back. Then the bell rang, even across the yard, even over boots on snow and men calling instructions. I heard the silver chime ring once in hard winter air. And after that, Claire screamed. Not the thin distress Arthur had recorded before. A full voice, ripping, human, alive. By the time we were allowed onto the property, she was wrapped in 2 blankets in the back of an ambulance with Dr. Reeves kneeling in front of her, speaking in the slow, clear tone of someone trying to build a bridge fast enough to matter. Lily sat in a state police SUV, clutching a stuffed fox and refusing to let go of a paperback copy of Charlotte's Web. Evan was in handcuffs by the stone wall, shouting about overreach and malpractice. Dr. Voss was not shouting. She was trying to negotiate. That told me everything about which one of them really understood what they had done. I took 1 step toward the ambulance and stopped because I did not know if Claire would even know me there, in the middle of sirens and snow and the ruins of a lie finally forced into daylight. Then Dr. Reeves looked up, saw me, and nodded. I climbed in. Claire turned her head slowly. For a second, her gaze skated past me, then returned, then held. "Dad," she whispered. I sat on the bench opposite her because the medic had no room to spare and because years of being kept away had made every inch feel like something that needed to be re-earned. "I'm here." She started crying without sound. I wanted to say 1,000 things. I am sorry. I believed them. I should have come sooner. Your mother never stopped preparing for this. Lily is safe. The bell cannot touch you now. What I said was the only thing that seemed simple enough to survive the moment. The loons lied at dusk that year. Claire let out a broken laugh and folded in on herself. And that was the first real thing either of us had been able to hold in a very long time. People think rescue ends the story because they mistake extraction for freedom. It is not the same thing. Getting Claire and Lily off that property did not return 5 stolen years. It did not repair the grooves fear had carved into my granddaughter's instincts. It did not untangle the medical language wrapped around my daughter's mind. And it certainly did not end Evan. In some ways, it made him more dangerous. He was released on bond 2 days later, pending investigation into custodial interference, billing irregularities, unlawful restraint questions, and a list of other phrases that sounded respectable enough to leave out the ruined lives underneath them. Dr. Voss retained counsel before sunset on the day of the rescue and immediately began positioning herself as a misunderstood specialist whose nuanced treatment methods had been willfully mischaracterized by a panicked family system. People like that do not collapse when caught. They rebrand. They triangulate. They call their own exposure harassment and wait for institutions to grow tired. Claire and Lily were placed in a protected temporary arrangement that Naomi managed with a precision I will never stop being grateful for. Lily came home with me under emergency kinship placement because the child welfare worker on scene had eyes in her head and understood, within 10 minutes of talking to my granddaughter, that public order had never been the same thing as private safety in Evan's houses. Claire, however, could not simply come home with me. Not because I did not want her there. God knows I did. But because she was medically fragile, sedated, disoriented, and carrying the kind of trauma that makes even familiar walls feel suspect. Dr. Reeves recommended a secure inpatient unit for a short stabilization and detox period under clinicians with no ties to Voss. Claire agreed to it only after Lily was allowed to sit on her bed in the hospital room and say, in the plain, certain voice children sometimes have when adults have exhausted all other language, "Mom, Grandpa's not taking me away. He's taking us out." That sentence should have come from me. It should have come from courts and doctors and social workers long before. Instead, it came from a child. During the first week, Claire slept as if someone had finally stopped chasing her through her own body. During the second week, pieces began to surface. Not all at once, not in order, not with cinematic neatness. Memory under coercion does not return like a file opening. It returns like things washing up after a storm. One shoe, then a frame, then a door, then a part of yourself you thought had belonged to someone else. The first thing Claire said that mattered in a legal sense came on a Thursday morning while I was sitting by her hospital bed reading the newspaper aloud just to give the room a shape that was not entirely clinical. She interrupted a story about municipal budgeting and asked, very quietly, "Did I ever tell you I hated microwaves?" I lowered the paper slowly. "You did." She stared at the blanket on her lap. "I knew that." I said nothing. She swallowed. "He told Dr. Voss I heated Lily's bottle in the microwave. I knew I wouldn't. I knew I hated them. But he kept saying sleep loss makes people inconsistent, and then Dr. Voss said it was common to lose confidence in procedural memory under maternal stress. So after a while," she looked up at me, eyes raw and ashamed. "After a while, I thought maybe hating them and using them at the same time was proof something was wrong. That is what gaslighting does when paired with authority. It does not only make you question a fact, it makes you question the part of yourself that knows why the fact matters." I reached for her hand carefully, leaving room for her to pull away if touch still felt like demand. "You were tired, you were scared, and they built a world around your fear." She flinched at the word "they," then nodded. Over the next 10 days more came. The towels. Evan moving them and later asking if she had forgotten where she put them. The vaccination card disappearing and reappearing in a folder she never used. A burner phone Dr. Voss called the containment line, reserved for emergencies, through which Claire was required to report spikes in intrusive thoughts. The nighttime standing over Lily's crib, which had happened exactly once and lasted perhaps 10 seconds before Claire realized she had fallen asleep in the rocking chair and woken disoriented. Evan retold it for months, as if he had found her in a trance. The bruise on Lily's arm from a stroller buckle, Claire blamed herself for until she learned, much later, that Evan had hurried the straps and then said she was too distracted to be trusted. "I kept trying to become safe enough," Claire said one afternoon, staring out the hospital window at a delivery van backing into the loading zone below. That was the whole game, wasn't it? They made safe a horizon that kept moving. She was right. Safety had never been the goal. Compliance had. The silver wind chime turned out to be the purest expression of that. At first, during Claire's early days with Dr. Voss, the chime was introduced as an anchoring sound, something to interrupt panic spirals. Claire associated it with Ruth's porch and the summers at Black Pine Lake. Dr. Voss framed that familiarity as therapeutic. Whenever Claire felt overloaded, she was supposed to hear the chime, pause, orient to the room, and regulate her breathing. Alone, in decent hands, that might have remained a harmless grounding cue. But Evan and Dr. Voss did not leave it there. They paired the sound with correction, with stopping mid-sentence, with turning to the wall, with hands flat against the surface, with silence until permission resumed. A nervous system trick became a dominance ritual. Claire explained it in halting pieces over 2 sessions with Dr. Reeves and one long tearless conversation with Sheila, the advocate who by then had become a steady presence in our orbit. At first it was only during panic, Claire said. Then it was when I got loud. Then when I argued. Then when I remembered something differently than Evan did. Dr. Voss said the posture interrupted perseveration. She said walls are neutral and eye contact can intensify cognitive fusion. Did you believe that? Sheila asked gently. Claire laughed once without humor. I believed anything if it meant I might see Lily longer. That line should be carved into every courtroom in America. People do not need to be chained to be held captive. Sometimes all you have to do is make access to their child conditional on surrender. Lily, for her part, started talking in the safer ways children often do once the immediate source of power has been removed. Not in direct declarations at first, through preferences, through tiny refusals, through questions that revealed more than answers. Can I sleep with my door open here? Do you move things on purpose? If I forget where I put a book, does that mean I'm unsafe? Will you ever make me call you by your first name if I'm mad at you? That last question gutted me. Apparently Evan had periods he called reset days, during which Lily was not allowed to say daddy if she had been disrespectful. She had to say Evan until she demonstrated a calm tone and better choice-making. I sat on the edge of her bed that night while she held the stuffed fox the state police had found half buried in the back seat and asked, "Did your dad do that to your mom too?" Lily nodded into the blanket. Sometimes she had to say Dr. Voss, not Miriam, because first names were manipulative closeness. Children remember the weirdest details because weirdness is often the only part adults do not bother disguising. As Claire regained steadier sleep and the drug fog began to thin, something else returned too. Anger. At first it scared her, then it steadied her. I keep wanting to tell everyone the story from the beginning, she said one evening in the family room of the transitional apartment the hospital eventually moved her to. And then I hit this wall where I realize half of it is their version still living inside my head. That's normal, Dr. Reeves told her. Trauma and coercion don't just injure memory, they contaminate authorship. Part of healing is learning which sentences were never yours. He had a slow manner that some people might mistake for vagueness, but Claire trusted him because he never rushed to finish her thought for her. He also did one thing Dr. Voss apparently never did. He admitted uncertainty. If he did not know whether something was a trauma echo, a medication effect, or a formed memory, he said so. Real clinicians, I learned, are not afraid of complexity. Frauds are. They bury it under certainty. By the end of the month, the initial criminal investigation had expanded. The Vermont property search yielded duplicate medication logs, unsigned treatment templates, and archived recordings from the annex at Briar Lane. Some were too painful for Claire to review, some were too damning for even Voss's attorney to spin as misunderstood therapeutic practice. On multiple clips, the chime could be heard followed by direct commands from either Evan or Voss. Face the wall, hands flat, start again, use the safe words, try the truth this time. That's not what happened. You are blending memory with emotion. We don't reward dysregulation. I watched 2 minutes of one video before shutting the screen and walking outside to throw up in the snow behind the legal aid office where Naomi had set up our temporary war room. Arthur followed me out and stood beside me without speaking until I could breathe again. When I finally straightened, I said, "Why didn't he just leave? Why do all this? If he wanted money, why not divorce her and find someone else?" Arthur stared across the parking lot. Because money wasn't the only appetite, control was, and control gets addictive when it works. He was right, but I still did not understand the depth of the greed until Naomi found the draft settlement memo on one of Evan's confiscated laptops. There it was in plain business prose. Proposed long-term funding architecture for Claire Mercer therapeutic maintenance. Primary sources. Liquidation of Black Pine parcel. Ongoing annual family contribution from Daniel Harrow. Eventual petition for trustee substitution due age and emotional conflict. Secondary goals. Residential cottage conversion for winterized capacity. Tax shelter structuring through wellness retreat designation. Projected 10-year viability. 10-year viability. My daughter and granddaughter had been turned into a business model. I stared at the screen and felt something inside me settle into a colder, more durable form than rage. Rage is hot. Hot things burn fast. What took its place in me that day was different. It was patient, exact, capable of waiting. Naomi saw my face and said, Don't what? Whatever you're thinking. I'm thinking prison sounds too simple." She closed the laptop. "Then think strategically." It turned out strategy still had one important job left because criminal charges alone, however satisfying they may sound to people who have never spent time near the justice system, were not enough. Cases take time. Plea negotiations blur outcomes. Defense attorneys sand facts into technicalities. And most dangerously, Evan and Voss were already positioning themselves to argue that Claire's partial confusion during parts of treatment proved the situation was a tragic overreach in a difficult recovery, not a deliberate scheme. We needed something undeniable, something that showed motive, awareness, and continuing intent after exposure, something not pulled from old videos or disputed paperwork, something live. That was when Naomi proposed the settlement bait. On paper, it would look reasonable. With Claire newly out, investigators circling, and media interest starting to sniff around the Vermont angle, a private civil settlement could appear attractive to everyone. We would float that Daniel Harrow, elderly father and co-trustee, wished to spare Claire the ordeal of prolonged testimony in exchange for Evan and Dr. Voss relinquishing any claim to involvement in her care, waiving spousal access arguments, and accepting a structured property resolution involving the Black Pine land. In reality, the offer was poison dressed as peace. Why would they take it? Because greed and vanity often survive exposure. Evan still believed he understood me better than I understood him. He thought I was an old man motivated primarily by shame and family image. He thought if he looked regretful enough and practical enough, I would pay to make the story disappear. Dr. Voss, meanwhile, needed something even more desperately than money. Validation. A paper trail that implied her methods were simply controversial rather than criminal. If both of them came to the table thinking they could salvage land, reputation, or leverage, they might talk. And if they talked in the right room, under the right circumstances, with the right people listening, then the trap Ruth wrote into the trust years earlier could close not only financially, but psychologically. They would tell on themselves trying to preserve what they believed was still available. Claire hated the idea at first. I don't want to sit across from him. You may not have to, Naomi said. No. Claire's voice was steadier now than it had been in weeks. If he thinks Dad is the only one making decisions, he'll keep writing me out of my own life. I'm done being evidence in rooms where I'm not a person. That was the moment I knew she was returning in a way deeper than memory. She was not merely remembering her life. She was reclaiming authorship. Still, we built the plan around her safety. She would attend only if Dr. Reeves approved. She would have full control to leave at any time. Lily would be nowhere near it. Arthur would be present. State investigators would be briefed. And every square inch of the room would be wired legally through a cooperation agreement once prosecutors understood exactly what we were trying to capture. The location mattered. I wanted neutral territory. Naomi wanted professional distance. Claire unexpectedly wanted Black Pine. Why? I asked when she said it. She sat very still for a long time before answering. Because he thinks that land already belongs to the story he wrote. I want him to feel it stop belonging to him. So that was that. Black Pine Lake, the old cottage Ruth loved, would host the final meeting. Not in the main house Evan renovated. That place had too much of him in it. In the original cottage, the smaller structure by the shore that remained mostly unchanged except for electricity and repaired windows. The same porch where Ruth used to hang the silver chime every May. The same kitchen table where Claire once spilled an entire pitcher of lemonade and cried until Ruth told her some disasters improve a floor. Naomi nearly objected on emotional grounds and then caught herself. Claire did not need protection from every hard place forever. She needed one hard place returned to her in truth. The weeks leading up to the meeting were their own form of weather. Claire practiced with Sheila and Dr. Reeves. Not lines, but recognition. What happens in your body when Evan reframes your memory? What happens when Dr. Voss uses clinical certainty? What phrase tells you you're drifting into their language? What sensation means you need a break? Lily started first-grade counseling with a child therapist who understood coercive homes and did not ask leading questions. Instead, she built worlds with blocks and dolls, and let Lily decide who locked doors and who opened them. I sat through interviews with detectives, financial auditors, pharmacists, and one assistant attorney general who kept saying unusual treatment environment in the careful tone bureaucrats use when reality is too grotesque for office language. And late at night, when the house was finally quiet and Lily asleep in Ruth's old guest room and the refrigerator humming like it had hummed through every season of my adult life, I let myself think about revenge. Not the theatrical kind. Not fantasies of fists or public screaming or the manly nonsense people tell each other about settling things. What I wanted was colder. I wanted Evan and Dr. Voss to experience the failure of their own script in real time. I wanted them to step into a room expecting to manage the narrative and leave understanding that every sentence had in fact been one more brick in the wall closing behind them. I wanted them to discover that while they were training my daughter to face a wall and wait for permission, Ruth had already built a world in which their greed could never legally reach the center of what they wanted. That to me was not cruelty. It was balance. 3 days before the meeting, Naomi received the signed preliminary order triggering the trust's coercion clause in full if financial self-interest were further demonstrated. She held the paper up in my kitchen and said, "If they so much as imply they shaped care around access to the parcel, the rest locks." I read the order and felt Ruth again, not like a ghost, like structure, like beams holding. Claire read it too and let out the first honest smile I had seen from her in half a decade. "He always thought he was the only one planning ahead," she said. Then she reached into the tote bag she now carried everywhere and took out the silver wind chime. The real one, recovered from evidence, bagged, released under protocol because it belonged to our family. "I want it there," she said. "Why?" I asked. She looked at the crescent moon top, then at me, "Because I want him to ring it once and watch nothing happen." For a long second, nobody in the room spoke. Then Arthur said very quietly, "Now that is a plan I can respect." The morning of the meeting came clear and hard, a sky so blue it looked almost fabricated, as if weather itself had decided to stage a performance about how calm things could seem when they were anything but. I drove to Black Pine before sunrise because I needed the hour alone. The lake was iron flat. The pines held their shadows low. The old cottage smelled the way it always had in winter after the heat kicked on for the first time. Cedar, dust warmed into sweetness, old enamel, memories stored in wood grain. I walked from room to room checking things Naomi had already checked twice. Recording equipment hidden in plain sight through cooperation with investigators. Secondary audio capture near the stove. Camera in the bookshelf molding. The legal agreement folder on the table containing exactly what we wanted them to think it contained, and several things it actually did. The visible pages suggested a path forward. Daniel Harrow, aging father, wished to resolve private family conflict. Black Pine parcel would be sold into a restricted care trust. Claire's testimony in civil matters might be limited to preserve her nervous system. Evan could avoid direct financial penalties if he withdrew spousal claims and signed non-disparagement terms. Dr. Voss could separate from future care decisions while retaining certain consultative immunities subject to settlement language. A merciful exit. That was the bait. The invisible reality was very different. The room was wired. State investigators waited a quarter-mile away by the road in unmarked vehicles. The Assistant Attorney General had signed off on the recording parameters. Naomi had structured the papers so that any acknowledgement of prior knowledge, financial expectation, or manipulative treatment rationale would immediately support both the trust lock and prosecutorial expansion. Most importantly, Claire had chosen to attend. Not to be brave for me, not to perform recovery, to end authorship theft on the record. When she arrived with Naomi and Dr. Reeves a little after 9, I felt my whole body tense in ways I had not anticipated. She wore jeans, boots, and a heavy cream sweater borrowed from Naomi because none of her own winter clothes yet felt neutral enough. Her hair had begun to grow out, color had returned to her face. But there were still moments when her eyes moved to doorways too quickly, when a sudden shift in sound made her shoulders rise. Recovery is not a glow-up. It is 1,000 contested reactions. She stood on the porch for a moment looking at the lake. "I thought I'd never see it without him narrating it," she said. I opened the door wider. "It's yours to narrate now." Inside, Dr. Reeves reviewed the plan one last time. No one stays seated if they do not want to. No one answers a question they do not want to answer. If you feel pulled into defending your sanity instead of describing facts, pause. They will try to make you prove yourself in their language. Don't. Claire nodded. Naomi added, "If Evan or Voss begin talking about what was best for you, ask who benefited. Make them define benefit." Arthur, standing by the sink with his coffee, said, "And if you want the room ended, scratch your thumb against your first finger twice. I'll interrupt." Claire looked at all of us, then laughed softly. I spent 5 years around people who called that support and meant control. It's strange how support actually feels quieter. She was right. Real support does not crowd. It braces. At 10:31, the first SUV came up the drive. Dr. Voss arrived alone, in charcoal wool and a camel coat, carrying a leather folio as if she were still the most competent person in every room she entered. She looked older than I remembered from Briar Lane, though perhaps that was simply what happens when polish no longer reflects power back correctly. Naomi met her at the door. "This is a privileged settlement discussion," she said. "You understand the ground rules?" Dr. Voss removed her gloves finger by finger. "I understand that distressed families often need narratives to survive transitions." Naomi did not blink. Inside. Evan arrived 7 minutes later. No handcuffs this time. No police car. No visible consequence except the strain around his mouth and the fact that for the first time since I had known him, he did not seem to assume charm would solve the room before he entered it. He stopped dead when he saw Claire at the table. For a second, real emotion crossed his face. Not love, not grief, shock, then calculation flooded back in to cover it. "Claire," he said softly, "I didn't know you'd be here." Claire folded her hands on the table. "That's because this isn't your meeting to design." He actually smiled at that, the old way, admiring, intimate, as if her clarity were a trick he might still co-opt. "Good," he said. "You sound stronger." Dr. Reeves took the chair near the window without introducing himself again. Arthur leaned against the counter. Naomi opened a yellow legal pad. I sat at the head of the table, Ruth and I bought at a yard sale our second summer at the lake, and for the first time in months I felt not old but exact. The meeting began with paper. Naomi summarized the proposed settlement in language so dry it made every terrible thing sound temporarily civilized. Withdrawal of claims, separation of care authority, property restructuring, confidentiality terms, cooperation in ongoing record production. It was all true enough to be plausible and vague enough to invite greed. Evan listened with his fingers steepled. Dr. Voss took notes. When Naomi finished, Evan was the first to speak. I need to be clear, he said. I never sought financial control for myself. Everything I did was to preserve stability for Claire and Lily. Naomi did not look up. Then the parcel has no relevance to your decision-making. Of course it has relevance, he snapped before softening his tone. Not for me, for care, long-term care. There it was. First line in, always too fast around money. Dr. Voss stepped in smoothly. What Mr. Mercer means is that severe relational trauma can require extended environmental support. The family has struggled to accept that Claire's needs are not acute but structural. Claire turned toward her very slowly. Structural for whom? Dr. Voss returned the look with professional patience. For your nervous system, Claire. No. Claire's voice stayed calm. For whom was the structure useful? The question sat in the room like a blade no one had expected to see unsheathed so early. Dr. Voss adjusted a page in her folio. Useful is not the framework I would use. That's because useful sounds like benefit, Claire said, and benefit makes money visible. Evan laughed softly as if indulging a child who had surprised adults with a clever phrase. No one is talking about money except your father and Naomi. I spoke for the first time. Strange, since I spent 5 years wiring $30,000 a year wherever you told me my daughter was. He looked at me as if disappointed in my crudeness. Daniel, we all know high-acuity psychiatric care is expensive. Was it? A beat. Of course it was. More expensive in Vermont, I said. Or behind your garage? Arthur made a small note on the yellow pad beside him. He later told me that was the moment he saw Evan realize the room was not drifting where he wanted it, but Evan still thought he could out-talk us. That framing is exactly the problem, he said. You reduce everything to optics. Claire was not behind my garage. She was in a transitional safety space designed to keep her connected to Lily without flooding the attachment system. The phrase made even Dr. Reeves blink. Claire leaned back in her chair. Did I ask to live there? Evan opened his hands. At the time, your insight was partial. That wasn't my question, Dr. Voss interceded. Consent in trauma contexts is dynamic. Naomi finally looked up. Wonderful, then let's get dynamic. Did Claire at any point receive a written explanation that the annex at Briar Lane was a substitute for residential care previously billed as occurring in Vermont? Dr. Voss's jaw tightened. Treatment models evolve. That is not an answer. It is the clinically accurate answer. Claire looked at the woman who had spent years translating obedience into recovery and said with devastating plainness, You used my mother's wind chime to make me face a wall. No one moved. The lake outside made a small sound against the rocks. Dr. Voss's face did not change, only her pupils did. That is an emotionally loaded simplification, she said. Claire nodded once. Good, then simplify this too. Why did the bell ring when I disagreed with Evan? Evan turned toward Claire in immediate paternal concern, the same choreography he had always used when frightened by her clarity. Because you were escalating. No, she said, because he didn't like me remembering differently. I watched him hear, perhaps for the first time, that the old script no longer landed. He shifted tactics. Claire, I know this is painful. I know other people have gotten in your ear. But there were nights you begged for containment. There were weeks you said you were afraid of yourself with Lily. Claire's face lost color, and for a second I thought he had found the old doorway, the old shame, the old reflex to defend his version because some parts of it still touched true terror. Then she put her hand flat on the table and asked the question Sheila had told us mattered most. Who got calmer when I obeyed? Evan stopped. He actually stopped, because there is no answer to that question that keeps innocence intact. Dr. Voss tried to save him. That is a false binary. Claire did not look at her. Who got angrier when I remembered? My own hands trembled under the table, but Claire's voice did not. Naomi said quietly, Please answer the question. Evan exhaled through his nose. Everyone got calmer because the household stopped destabilizing. The household, Claire repeated. Not me, not Lily, the household. He rolled his eyes for the first time in years in front of me. Not the polished, tolerant role of a man burdened by difficult care. A real one. Irritated. Superior. Yes, he said, because when you were spinning, everything spun. Claire swallowed. I wasn't spinning when I asked why Dad still thought I was in Vermont. Now the room changed. Dr. Voss leaned in. We agreed not to discuss non-current relational grievances. Naomi smiled very slightly. Actually, we agreed nothing of the sort. I pushed the first visible folder across the table. Maybe we should discuss it, I said. Since the parcel at this lake was apparently relevant to care, and care was apparently structured around my daughter not knowing where she lived. Evan did not touch the folder. What do you want from this, Daniel? Punishment? Apology? Permission to feel like you saved her? There are sentences that reveal more than the speaker intends. That one told me he still believed this was primarily a struggle between men. I almost pitied him. Claire answered before I could. I want you to hear yourself, she said. Just once, without me trapped enough to make your sentences feel true. For the first time, something like unease crossed Dr. Voss's face. She turned to Naomi. If this is not a genuine settlement discussion, we should leave. Arthur spoke from the counter without moving. You can. He had been mostly silent until then, which made the sentence hit harder. Evan looked from Arthur to the door to Dr. Voss and then back to Claire. He was doing calculations. Leave too early and lose the parcel. Stay too long and risk more exposure. He chose what greedy men often choose when they still think they can bend the middle. He stayed. Fine, he said. You want honesty? Honesty is that the old arrangement was impossible. Claire was not functioning. She was confusing routine with danger, attachment with suffocation, ordinary motherhood stress with catastrophe. Claire laughed once, soft and astonished. You moved towels so I'd think I was blacking out. It landed harder than I expected because it was so ordinary. No dramatic allegation, no theatrical memory, just towels. Evan's mouth tightened. I did not. You did, she said. And when I cried because I couldn't find them, you called Miriam and asked if object displacement testing was useful for disorganization mapping. Dr. Voss went very still. Naomi looked up sharply. Object displacement testing? Dr. Voss's voice returned, precise and cool. There are observational strategies used in high-complexity domestic assessments, informal, contextual, non-punitive. Arthur pushed off the counter. Say that in English. No one answered. Claire did. It means they moved things and watched whether I blamed myself. The silence after that felt different. Not tense now, falling. Evan knew it too. He turned to Dr. Voss with the smallest flash of anger, the first visible fracture between them all morning. You said that language wouldn't be discoverable. Naomi's pen stopped. So did my heart for one perfect second. Dr. Voss realized what she had lost the instant he said it. Too late. What I said, she replied carefully, was that contextual interventions were clinically defensible when properly documented. Evan let out a short, disbelieving laugh. Properly documented? You billed Vermont while she was 20 feet from my garage. And there it was. Not because we trapped them with some magician's trick. Because once controllers stop trusting each other, truth leaks out faster than lies can caulk it. Naomi did not interrupt. Neither did Arthur. Neither did I. You do not interrupt a ceiling when it has finally begun to fall. Dr. Voss's composure thinned. You are the one who insisted local proximity would preserve paternal continuity and justify ongoing family contributions. Family contributions. My money. Claire's jaw tightened, but she stayed silent, which was harder and braver than speaking. Evan looked at her, then at me, and for the first time let contempt show without dressing it. Do you know what your father was going to do the first year? He said to Claire. He was going to march in and tell you to toughen up. He didn't understand what you were like then. I did not move. He wanted me reactive. He wanted male confrontation to muddy the cleaner evil already sitting on the table. So Claire answered. What I was like then, she said, was sleep-deprived and scared and still easier to manipulate than Lily. That landed too, because Lily's name changed the room from treatment dispute to family harm. Dr. Voss spoke faster now, trying to resize professional altitude. No one manipulated Lily. Children in destabilized maternal systems often adopt coaching language because adults are trying to preserve emotional predictability. Arthur snorted. Naomi said, such as telling an 8-year-old she confuses treatment with memories? No answer. Such as making her call her father by his first name on reset days? No answer. Such as teaching her that a camera was an eye? No answer. Such as keeping her mother in a glass room and calling it proximity instead of captivity? No answer. The room had reached that rare point where shame and strategy collide and produce something uglier than either alone. Evan's leg began bouncing under the table. Dr. Voss took her water glass and did not drink. I placed my hand on the second folder. This is the part you both miscalculated, I said. They looked at me. You thought the parcel was the center of what you were building toward. You thought if Claire remained unstable long enough and I got old enough and embarrassed enough, eventually the land and the trust would align with your version of reality. Evan said nothing. Which was answer enough. I opened the folder. Inside lay the coercion clause order, the trust activation papers, the freeze notices already prepared pending verbal acknowledgement, the accounting memo Naomi built from their own filings. Ruth wrote around you before she ever met you, I said quietly. She wrote a structure in which any attempt to convert Claire's incapacity into spousal leverage would lock every protected asset you ever wanted behind independent control. For the first time all morning, real fear crossed Evan's face. That's not possible. Naomi slid the signed order toward him. It's already done. He grabbed the paper and scanned it too fast to understand, then again slower. The skin around his eyes changed. It is astonishing how much of a person's character becomes visible once they realize the future they were privately counting on no longer exists. Dr. Voss leaned over his shoulder, her lips pressed flat. The parcel cannot be liquidated by you, Naomi said. The trust distributions cannot be redirected by you. No spouse substitute authority, no therapeutic maintenance architecture, no care trust shell, no 10-year viability. Evan looked up sharply. How do you know about that memo? Arthur finally smiled, not pleasantly. Because you people document your greed like it's a startup. For a second, I thought Evan might lunge across the table. Instead, he did something better for us and worse for himself. He tried to justify. You don't understand what it took, he said, voice rising. Do you have any idea what living with her was like in those early months? The crying, the forgetting, the panic every hour. She could not decide anything. She needed structure. Voss gave us a framework. I built the annex because the alternative was full institutionalization or losing Lily to chaos. Claire's face had gone very still. And the money? She asked. He looked at her as if offended by the crudeness. Money kept it sustainable. Sustainable for what? For care. Mine? He hesitated. Too long. Dr. Voss cut in. For the system supporting you. Claire nodded slowly, taking the words in like evidence. The system supporting me, not me. Then she reached into the tote bag at her feet and placed the silver wind chime on the table between us. No one had mentioned it before. No one expected it. The crescent moon caught the pale winter light from the lake window. Evan stared at it. I watched the exact moment he understood what Claire intended. Her voice was almost kind. Go ahead. No one moved. She pushed it 1 inch closer to him. Ring it. He laughed uncertainly. What? Ring it, Claire said. You always believed the sound proved who I was. Let's test the theory. Dr. Voss stood up. This is theatrics. We are done. But she did not leave, because she needed to know too. Needed to know whether the old mechanism still worked. Needed to know whether their training had survived contact with truth. Evan looked at me, perhaps expecting me to stop it. I did not. He looked at Naomi. She only gestured toward the table. Finally, with a sneer meant to disguise discomfort, he reached out and flicked one of the tubes. The silver note rang through the cottage. Beautiful, thin, perfectly ordinary. Claire did not turn to the wall, did not put up her hands, did not go blank, did not ask permission. She looked directly at him and said, It's just weather now. I do not think I will ever witness a more complete transfer of power in a single sentence. Evan's face emptied. Dr. Voss closed her eyes briefly, as if something inside her had been professionally offended. Then Arthur's phone buzzed. Then Naomi's. Then mine. The coordinated triggers had gone live. Based on the recorded acknowledgments in the room and the already filed financial motions, the trust freeze executed. The bank accounts linked to the fraudulent treatment architecture froze. The parcel transfer possibilities closed. The Attorney General's office expanded the fraud referral, and state investigators started moving on the secondary warrants. I watched Evan read the alert on his phone. Once, twice, then again as if repetition might alter reality. What did you do? He asked, voice suddenly small. I almost answered, we did what you did not think old people and damaged women could do. Instead, I said the simplest thing. We listened. Then, because balance matters, I added, for longer than you realized. The knock at the door came 12 seconds later. Not loud, not dramatic, just official enough to make denial suddenly look childish. Arthur opened it. 2 investigators stepped in with neutral expressions and formal papers. Not cuffs, not yet, just process. That somehow made it more devastating. Mr. Mercer, Dr. Voss, we need your devices and your immediate acknowledgement of preservation obligations under expanded warrant authority. Evan stood so fast his chair hit the wall. This is insane. One of the investigators, a woman with a clipped gray bob and absolutely no appetite for male outrage, said, Then you'll have an excellent opportunity to explain your billing logic and confinement protocols. Dr. Voss gathered her folio with shaking hands. I will not respond without counsel. Smartest thing said here all day, Arthur murmured. As they were escorted out, Evan turned back toward Claire one last time. I still believe some part of him thought he could reach for the old lever. Guilt, attachment, shared history, anything. Claire, he said, softer now, you know I loved you. Claire looked at him for a long moment. Then she answered with the final cruelty truth reserves for people who mistake control for devotion. No, she said. You loved being the person who decided whether I got to feel safe. He had no reply. When the door shut behind them, the whole cottage seemed to release a breath it had been holding for years. No one spoke for several seconds. Then Claire leaned forward, put both elbows on the table, and began to laugh and cry at the same time. Not because she was broken, because bodies do not always know how to celebrate without also discharging fear. Naomi handed her a tissue. Arthur quietly unplugged the visible recorder. Dr. Reeves stayed still and let the wave pass through before saying, You stayed present. Claire wiped her face. I wanted to leave 5 times, but you didn't. She looked at the wind chime lying harmlessly on the table. I think that bell kept me alive longer than it should have, because part of me believed if I obeyed perfectly enough I'd get Lily back without breaking anything. I said, And now? She looked out the window at Black Pine Lake, then back at me. Now I think breaking the right things was the point. We stayed at the cottage until dusk, not because anyone had to, but because leaving too quickly after a life-changing moment can make the body feel ambushed. Lily was at my neighbor June's house back in Connecticut, baking sugar cookies and watching a movie with subtitles because she liked reading feelings and hearing them at the same time. She had no idea yet that the grown-ups at the lake had just made the future safer in a way she might not fully understand for years. Claire stood on the porch around 4:30 with Ruth's coat around her shoulders and watched the light thin over the water. "What did Mom's letter say?" I asked eventually. "The one he took?" She nodded. "I didn't read all of it, but I read enough before he came in." "What did it say?" Claire smiled through tiredness. "Mostly your mother being your mother. Specific, bossy, loving. She wrote that home is the place where you are allowed to remember a thing differently and still be loved while you sort it out." Ruth, always clearer than the rest of us. I looked across the frozen grass toward the larger renovated house Evan had contaminated with his plans. Even empty, it seemed arrogant somehow, full of angles and dark windows and the assumption that money could always replace inheritance if you were patient enough. Claire followed my gaze. "What happens to it?" she asked. "The new house?" She shrugged. "The transfer annex, the fake future." I thought about giving some practical answer involving probate, seizure questions, zoning review, whatever Naomi would eventually untangle. Instead, I said, "Whatever you want." She was quiet for a while. Then, with a calm I recognized from Ruth, she said, "Tear the glass out first, then give the structure to someone who teaches people how to build boats." Boats? So it has to learn how to carry instead of contain. I laughed, and because grief had long ago taught me to stop expecting dignity from tears, I let them come with the laugh. That night, driving home from the lake with Claire asleep in the passenger seat and the silver wind chime wrapped in a towel on the back seat, I understood something I wish I had learned earlier in life. Sometimes revenge is not pain returned. Sometimes it is function restored to the thing harm tried to redefine. A room becomes a workshop. A bell becomes weather. A daughter becomes author again. A parcel becomes unreachable to the people who turned care into finance. And the men who called that finance necessity are forced to say it out loud before it disappears. That was enough for me, or so I thought, because the story still had one more line to close, and it belonged not to courts or banks or even to me. It belonged to Lily. Children often understand the ending of a story before adults do. Not the legal ending, not the paperwork ending, the emotional one. Lily told me that 3 weeks after the meeting at Black Pine, while she sat cross-legged on the living room rug, building a crooked village out of wooden blocks and the stuffed fox's food bowl. "Mom doesn't whisper before she says true things now," she said. I looked up from the pile of insurance correspondence Naomi kept telling me not to sort emotionally. "What do you mean?" She placed a blue block on top of a red one with absurd concentration. "At Dad's house, everybody whispered before real things, or they said them in the car with music on, or in bathrooms with water. Mom still whispers sometimes, but not before true things." Then she added, as if explaining whether, "That means the house is different now." The house by then was mine again in all but name, not Briar Lane. That property remained under contested review for months, the annex treated as a potential evidence site until investigators finished imaging every camera, door log, and medication record. I mean my house. The one on Hawthorne Street with the deep porch, and the old maple in back, and the den where Ruth's books still leaned slightly to the left because she shelved by mood rather than alphabet. Claire did not move back in permanently at first. That would have been too simple, and therefore wrong. She spent part of each week in the transitional apartment with outpatient support, part with me, and once a week at Black Pine for exposure work that had nothing to do with Dr. Voss's definition of exposure and everything to do with reclaiming ordinary place. Lily floated between my house and Claire's supervised weekends, learning with visible relief that no one now treated ordinary desire as a symptom. There were setbacks. Of course there were. A kettle whistling too sharply one morning sent Claire into the laundry room shaking because the pitch hit some neighboring frequency in her nervous system near the bell. A pharmacy receipt in my mailbox with Dr. Voss's clinic network name on it for an unrelated insurance correction made Claire vomit before we even finished reading it. One night, Lily woke crying because she dreamed the camera eye from the annex was hidden in the smoke detector above her bed. We did not dramatize those setbacks. We named them. We walked through them. We let them be signs of injury rather than proof of defect. This is what I wish more people understood about healing. It does not look noble most days. It looks repetitive. It looks like grounding exercises at kitchen tables and medication reviews that do not humiliate the patient, and adults remembering not to overpraise simple autonomy, because overpraise can feel like scrutiny in a body used to being managed. The legal process, meanwhile, moved in ways alternately glacial and vicious. Dr. Voss's attorneys tried first to recast everything as an experimental but well-meaning family systems intervention, distorted by a grieving father and a volatile marital breakup. That theory survived exactly until the financial forensics matured. Once auditors lined up residential billing dates with contractor records, travel logs, and annex access data, the well-meaning posture started to rot. Evan tried a different route. He leaned into my supposed interference, then Claire's fragility, then a claim that his language in the recorded settlement meeting reflected frustration rather than truth. But recordings are ungenerous things. They replay tone even when words try to wriggle. They replay pauses too, especially the one after Claire asked who benefited, and he answered in circles until the system revealed itself. The charges that eventually stuck were less dramatic in name than the lives beneath them. Insurance fraud, wire fraud, falsification of treatment records, coercive control evidence introduced in family findings, interference with custodial rights, improper prescribing practices under administrative review, unlawful restraint questions folded into a broader plea framework. People ask whether that felt satisfying. Yes and no. Yes, because consequence matters. No, because no charge sheet, however thick, says a child should not know what an observation chair is. The part that felt most like justice happened somewhere quieter. It happened when the court approved a long-term protective parenting structure that placed Lily's primary residence with Claire, supported by me and monitored professionals of her choosing rather than his. It happened when the judge, a woman with silver hair and no patience for therapeutic euphemism, said on the record that maternal incapacity had been materially distorted by conflict of interest and coercive environmental practices. Materially distorted. It was still legal language, but beneath it I heard something closer to ordinary speech. We believe you. We see the trick. The trick does not define you anymore. Claire did not celebrate when the order came through. She went very quiet instead. That evening, she sat with me on the back steps while Lily and June's grandsons played flashlight tag in the yard and asked, "Do you know the worst part?" I thought of too many options and said nothing. "The worst part," Claire said, looking out at the dark grass, "is that there were moments I thanked them." I turned toward her. She laughed without humor. I thanked Miriam after she reduced my outside calls because I thought maybe too much family contact really was hurting Lily. I thanked Evan for building the first annex because he said it meant I could hear Lily through the yard and not lose attachment. I thanked them for the bell. I thanked them for the wall. Isn't that sick? No, I said. That's captivity. She covered her eyes with one hand. Sometimes I still hear their version first, like if I misplace my keys, there's still a voice saying, "See?" I waited until she looked at me again. Then answer it. With what? With the truth. Out loud if you have to. She considered that, then reached into her coat pocket, pulled out her keys, and held them up with a tired smile. I found them in 45 seconds. That's not psychosis, that's being human. We both laughed. And that laugh, ordinary as rain, felt like a repair. The first time Claire returned to Briar Lane after the rescue was not for grief or triumph. It was for inventory. The annex had already been gutted of active medical materials by investigators. What remained was architecture and stain. The white landscaping stones, the keypad dead now, the track marks where the blinds had run, the wall with faint palm prints near shoulder height where Claire had stood so often. The camera mount, the little grounding table that had once held laminated cue cards, and in the back cabinet a stack of folded towels. When Claire opened that cabinet and saw them, she just stood there for a very long time. Not shaking, not crying, looking. "Those were never for safety," she said finally. "They always kept them where I couldn't find them." Arthur, who came with us because sometimes witnesses to aftermath matter too, asked quietly, "Do you want us to bag them?" Claire thought about it. Then she shook her head. "No, I want to move them myself." So she did. She took the whole stack out and placed it in the center of the room one by one, like offerings to a truth too ridiculous to stay buried. White towel, gray towel, striped hand towel, guest towel with the stitched blue border Ruth once bought in Vermont. Each one a domestic object used as a fault line. When she finished, she stepped back and said, "There, that's what part of it was. Towels. If you ever doubt how strange abuse can look in daylight, remember that sentence." Sometimes the architecture of domination includes luxury invoices, psychiatric jargon, and court petitions. Sometimes it also includes towels. Lily never returned to the annex itself. She did not need to. Her healing moved through other rituals, choosing which lamp stayed on at night, hanging drawings on the refrigerator without asking if they were regulated enough. Learning that adults who love her do not require pre-approval for affection. Sitting with Claire at the dining room table on Sundays making lists of blue answers, their new shared practice for telling truths that felt big. A blue answer could be practical. "I don't like peas, I want to wear the striped socks." It could also be enormous. "I was scared when you were quiet because quiet used to mean danger. I thought maybe if I was very perfect, Dad would let Mom come back inside. Sometimes I miss him, and then I feel bad." The first time Lily said that last one, Claire looked stricken. But Sheila had prepared us. Children can miss harmful parents. Missing is not endorsement. Love is sticky. Fear is sticky too. You do not heal children by punishing them for having mixed weather. So Claire answered the way Ruth would have. "Blue answer back," she said. "You can miss somebody and still need them far away." Lily seemed to physically relax at being allowed complexity. That, more than any verdict, may be the thing that saves her long term. As for the larger Black Pine house Evan remodeled into his future, Claire kept her promise about what it would become. Once the property questions cleared and enough of the financial contamination had been sorted, she hired a local boat builder named Elias Mann, who lost his workshop in a fire years earlier and had been teaching out of borrowed garages ever since. He came to the cottage with rough hands, polite eyes, and absolutely no interest in family drama beyond where not to step during demolition. Claire walked him to the separate annex and said, "I want the glass out, every panel, every blind, every lock. Then I want benches, open doors, and a big table in the middle." "What for?" he asked. She looked at the structure as if answering herself more than him. "For people learning how to make things that move." By summer, the place smelled of pine shavings and varnish. Teenagers from the county came for weekend classes. Veterans with bad shoulders sanded ribs for small lake boats. A widow from Burlington built a canoe because she said grief needed an object with a direction. No one faced walls there. No one obeyed bells. The room learned carrying. The old Briar Lane annex took longer to resolve because evidence sites do not transform on your preferred timeline. But once it finally cleared, Claire sold the property entirely. She kept none of the house Evan had contaminated with system language. Not out of fear, out of refusal. Some places are better returned to the market than turned into lifelong arguments with ghosts. The proceeds went where Ruth always intended hard-won assets to go, part to Lily's future. Part to Claire's own independent account with safeguards she designed herself. Part to the restoration of the original Black Pine cottage. And a small, deliberate part to a fund for legal and advocacy support for women leaving coercive control situations wrapped in care. Claire named it the Blue Answer Fund. When she told me, I laughed until I cried. Evan hated that name in court. Said it made private pain into branding. The judge, bless her, replied that survivors are allowed to name what helped them survive. Dr. Voss eventually took a plea that spared Claire a full trial on some counts while preserving the record of misconduct. She lost licensure privileges in multiple states. Her lawyers never admitted malice. They did not need to. Consequences are sometimes the only confession worth chasing. Evan went to trial on the financial and interference charges that remained after negotiations failed. He could not bear compromise because compromise required surrendering authorship of the story. On the stand, he still sounded at moments like a man explaining difficult excellence to lesser minds. That was his weakness in the end. He kept trying to teach the jury why control was sensible. Juries, like children, often understand tone before theory. When prosecutors played the recording of Claire asking who benefited and Evan answering that money kept it sustainable, the room changed the same way it had in the cottage. Not because every detail became suddenly clear, because appetite did. Appetite is easy for human beings to recognize once it stops wearing concern well. The verdict came on a rainy Thursday. I will not pretend I felt noble hearing it. I felt relieved, savage, tired, old, young, vindicated, empty, grateful. Mostly I felt like I had finally reached the end of a long corridor in which every door kept opening into another smaller locked room. That night Claire and Lily slept at my house, because storms make the lake road unpleasant, and because after verdicts, whatever people say on television, no one actually wants to sit alone with all the feeling. We ate takeout Chinese at the kitchen table. Ruth refinished in 1996 and watched a terrible baking show because Lily said she needed nonsense after Big People Court. Around 10:30, once Lily had gone up to bed, Claire and I stood in the den looking at the old bookshelf where Ruth's guidance manuals still leaned against mystery novels and gardening books. I used to think if I could explain it perfectly, Claire said, then maybe I'd stop being angry. Did it work? She smiled faintly. No. Turns out I stopped needing the perfect explanation before the anger eased. What eased it? She thought for a long time, then said, watching Lily choose loud things again. That was true. Loud things returned slowly to our life. Not conflict, not chaos, volume with innocence inside it, music while cleaning, pots clattering on purpose during pancake mornings, Lily singing wrong lyrics with total confidence, Claire laughing from her stomach instead of her throat. One Sunday in early autumn, almost a year after the rescue, Lily ran through the yard with a silver ribbon tied to a stick, making it flutter behind her like a tiny comet. The motion caught my eye from the porch, and for a split second, my body braced as if some sound cue were about to command silence. Then Lily shouted, "Look, Grandpa, weather wand!" And the bracing passed. That is what recovery often is. Not never being triggered again. Being triggered and then discovering the present can answer back faster. I kept Ruth's wind chime for months in the cedar chest after the meeting at Black Pine, because none of us quite knew what to do with it. Destroying it felt theatrical. Keeping it visible felt too raw. So it waited, wrapped in an old flour sack towel, while we all became slightly more ourselves. The decision came from Lily. She found it while helping me look for a Monopoly house and said, "Is this the bad bell or the real bell?" I asked, "What do you think?" She held the crescent moon top in both hands. "I think it was a bad bell at bad houses, but maybe at our house it can just be weather again." So we hung it on the back porch in May. The first time it rang, all three of us stopped what we were doing. Claire at the sink, me with a screwdriver, Lily halfway under the table retrieving a runaway marker. The sound moved through the screen door and into the kitchen. No one faced the wall, no one put their hands flat, no one asked permission. Lily smiled first. "See? Just weather." Claire leaned against the counter and cried quietly for less than a minute. Then she dried her face, came over, and helped me tighten the porch hook. That was the ending, or one of them. The other ending came later, on an October afternoon nearly 2 years after the day at the harvest fair, when Lily and I returned to the same grounds for the same festival. Ferris wheel, donut stand, hayride, goats, teenagers in reflective vests pretending authority. Everything offensively normal. Claire came too that year, not because she needed to prove anything, because she wanted caramel apples. We stood near the same stretch of trampled grass by the Ferris wheel when Lily tugged Claire's sleeve and asked for another ticket strip. Claire bent down to hear her, and I watched the whole exchange with the terrible tenderness age has given me. When Claire straightened, she looked over at me. "Blue answer?" she asked. I laughed. "Always." She nodded toward the Ferris wheel. I used to think after everything that I'd never trust myself with joy in crowded places again. And I was wrong. She said it simply. No speech, no lesson, just an ordinary correction. Then Lily came racing back with cider on her upper lip and said, "Mom, Grandpa, hurry. The blue ribbon goat is judging everyone again." We went. That night, after the fair, after Lily fell asleep in the back seat on the drive home, and Claire sat beside me eating the last cold donut from a wax paper bag, she said something I have carried like a blessing ever since. "You know what saved me?" I assumed she meant Ruth's letter, or the tape, or Naomi, or the judge, or Lily whispering at the fair, or some combination too large to name. "What?" I asked. Claire looked out the window at the dark trees and said, "You didn't need me to be perfectly clear before you started believing me." I had no answer for a while. Then I said the truest thing I could. "I wish I had started sooner." She nodded. "Me too." And because some truths do not need optimism stapled to them, we left it there. If you are listening to this because something in it sounds familiar, let me say plainly what I wish someone had said into my life before the vocabulary got so dense and respectable around my daughter's suffering. Control does not become care because it learns clinical words. Isolation does not become treatment because invoices exist. A child repeating adult scripts is not proof the adults are wise. And if a person's freedom keeps shrinking while everyone around them keeps explaining why the shrinking is necessary, you are not watching healing. You are watching power teach itself new grammar. I used to think protection meant certainty, proof in hand, documents stacked, a flawless timeline, the kind of clarity old men fantasize about because it excuses waiting. Now I know protection sometimes begins much earlier and with far less. A child whispering at a fair, a sentence that sounds wrong in your bones, a pattern that makes ordinary life feel staged, the memory of how someone sounded before another person started defining all their feelings for them. Would I do things differently if I could go back? Yes. I would press harder when postpartum fear was first being translated into pathology by people who benefited from the translation. I would trust my discomfort sooner when Evan answered for Claire at my table. I would learn earlier that coercive control can wear concern the way wolves wear distance. I would not wait for the perfect piece of proof while imperfect harms piled up, and I would say out loud what too many fathers of my generation were trained not to say. I was afraid, I was confused, I thought being calm made me wise. Sometimes it only made me late. But late is not the same thing as never. That matters. For me, for Claire, for Lily, for anyone listening who has already made mistakes in the direction of passivity and now fears the cost of acting at all. The stories we tell about family often worship patience. Patience is good. Patience is holy in the right hands. In the wrong hands, patience becomes a hallway where abusers buy time. So if something in your life feels staged, if words like stability and regulation and safety are being used to justify one person losing more and more choice, if a child in that house sounds older than the adults, if a bell rings and only one person is ever expected to obey it, pay attention. Ask blue answer questions. Who gets calmer when I obey? Who gets angrier when I remember? Who benefits from my confusion? Who is always narrating me back to myself? Those questions did not just help save my daughter. They helped save me from the lie that old age is only a season of watching. Sometimes even at 67, you still have work left. Not loud work, not glamorous work. Just the stubborn work of refusing the false story until enough truth gathers to break it open. If this story stayed with you, tell me where you're listening from. Tell me what part hit you hardest. Tell me if you've ever had to relearn the sound of weather. And if you know someone living inside a language that keeps making them smaller, don't wait for perfect certainty before you care out loud. One last thing before we finish. This story was told in a dramatic narrative format, and some identifying details were changed. But the patterns inside it are real. Coercive control is real. Financial exploitation in families is real. Misuse of therapeutic language is real. Children being drafted into adult systems is real. If you are in immediate danger, reach out to local emergency services or a domestic violence hotline in your area. If you are not the one in danger but you suspect someone you love is living in a house where concern has become control, start documenting. Start noticing. Start asking blue answer questions. As for us, the wind chime still hangs on the porch. Some days it rings once and no one remarks on it. Some days Lily salutes the weather wand and Claire rolls her eyes. Some days I still stop for half a heartbeat before memory catches up with reality. Then the porch light swings a little. The kitchen smells like lemon bread. My granddaughter shouts from the yard. My daughter answers in her own voice, and the sound passes through our house belonging to no one. That is enough. More than enough. That is home.